Somewhere in the western Pacific Ocean, roughly 1,200 kilometers south of Tokyo, there is an island that smells like the end of the world. It is small, barely 8 square miles of volcanic rock thrust up from the sea floor by forces that are still, even now, very much alive beneath the surface. There are no rivers on this island, no springs, no shade to speak of. The ground in places is hot to the touch, and gases seep through cracks in the black sand, as though the earth itself is breathing. On still days, the sulfur hangs in the air like a warning. The beaches are the color of ash. The terrain is broken and strange. Ridges of compressed lava, ravines that seem to go nowhere. A squat volcanic cone brooding at the southern end, like something out of a fever dream. From the air, it looks a little like a pork chop. From the ground, in the winter of 1945, it looked like the closest thing to hell that young men from Ohio and California and Georgia had ever seen. And many of them would never see anything else. This is Iwo Jima. And what happened here, over 36 days, beginning on the 19th of February, 1945, was among the most ferocious, most concentrated, most costly episodes of close combat in the entire history of the Second World War. More than 70,000 American Marines landed on this island. Nearly 7,000 of them would not leave it alive. Another nearly 20,000 would be wounded. On the Japanese side, a garrison of more than 20,000 men had been ordered not to retreat, not to surrender, and not to die cheaply. Almost none of them survived. Generals who had seen fighting across 3 continents and 2 decades of warfare would later struggle to find words for what Iwo Jima was. Veterans of Guadalcanal, of Tarawa, of Peleliu, men who thought they had already seen the worst the Pacific had to offer, would say that Iwo Jima was different, that it had a quality unlike any of the others. A grinding, suffocating, invisible quality, as if the island itself was fighting back. In some ways, it was. Because what made Iwo Jima so extraordinary, what separated it from nearly every other battle of the Pacific War, was not fought at the waterline. It was not decided by naval gunfire, or air superiority, or amphibious doctrine. What made Iwo Jima so catastrophically, heartbreakingly different from almost everything that came before it was the work of one Japanese general, and what he had been doing underground for the better part of a year before the first American boot hit that black sand. More than 17 kilometers of tunnels, hundreds of interconnected bunkers, artillery positions that could fire and then vanish, an entire military world built beneath the surface of the island, invisible to reconnaissance aircraft, largely impervious to naval bombardment, designed not to stop the Americans from landing, but to kill them, slowly and methodically, once they were already ashore. The man who built that world understood, with cold clarity, that Japan was going to lose this battle. He planned for it anyway. He simply intended to make the Americans pay a price so staggering that the lessons of Iwo Jima would echo all the way to the decisions made about how and whether to end the war. And at the top of that volcanic cone in the island's south, on the morning of the 23rd of February 1945, 6 men raised a flag. A photographer pressed a button, and the image that resulted would become one of the most recognized, most reproduced, most argued over photographs in the history of human conflict. A picture that captured something true about sacrifice and collective effort, even as the men in it were still, at that very moment, in danger of being killed. 3 of them would be dead within weeks. This is the complete history of the Battle of Iwo Jima, and over the course of the next several hours, we are going to walk through every chapter of it, from the sulfurous geology of the island itself to the strategic calculations that put it at the center of the Pacific War. to the underground kingdom built by a general who knew he would die there, to the 36 days that consumed so many young lives, to the photograph and the men in it, and what became of them after, and to the long, quiet, still smoking aftermath that stretches all the way to the present day. If you are settling in for a long listen tonight, welcome. This is the kind of story that rewards patience. It is not a story with simple heroes and simple villains. It is not a story that ends cleanly or comfortably. It is a story about human beings, placed under the most extreme imaginable pressure, on both sides of a battle they did not choose, on a piece of rock barely larger than a mid-sized town, trying to do what they had been ordered to do and survive if possible. Some of them survived, many did not, and the island still smells like sulfur. The bones of men from both nations are still there, deep in tunnels that have never been fully excavated, in a piece of ground that is now Japanese sovereign territory, restricted, quiet, and largely invisible to the world that once watched it burn. Before we go any further, if you are new here, and this is the kind of documentary that speaks to you, take a moment and subscribe. These films take enormous care to produce, and every subscriber tells us to keep going, to keep building these long, careful, detailed explorations of the moments in history that deserve more than a short summary and a moving map. Iwo Jima deserves more than that. The men who fought there deserve more than that. So get comfortable. Let the voice carry you. If you fall asleep along the way, that is perfectly fine. This documentary will be here when you come back, and the story will still be waiting. Now, let us begin at the beginning. Let us begin with the island itself, with the geology and the geography, and the sulfur in the air, and the reason that planners in Washington and Tokyo, looking at the same maps from opposite directions, both arrived at the same conclusion in the same year, that this ugly, barren, smoking little rock in the middle of the Pacific was, for reasons of pure strategic mathematics, worth almost any price to hold or to take. Let us begin with an island that smelled like hell, and the two armies that were about to make it one. There is a place in the Pacific Ocean that the Earth has not yet finished making. It sits alone, roughly 1,200 kilometers south of Tokyo, surrounded by open water on every side, a dark and jagged interruption in an otherwise featureless stretch of blue. It is small enough that you could walk its entire length in under 2 hours, and barely wide enough, at its narrowest point, to cross in a few minutes. It smells, unmistakably and permanently, of sulfur, of something burning beneath the surface, something unresolved, something that has been smoldering for longer than any human record can account for. The sea around it is often discolored, stained a faint and sickly yellow-green, where volcanic gases seep upward through the ocean floor. Sailors who passed near it in earlier centuries gave it a wide berth, not out of superstition, but because the smell alone was enough to warn them that the earth here was not entirely solid, not entirely safe, not entirely finished with its own violent becoming. The island's Japanese name translates, with blunt accuracy, as Sulphur Island. It rises out of the western Pacific along the chain of volcanic islands known as the Volcano Islands, a remote and largely forgotten fragment of Japanese territory that had never attracted settlers in meaningful numbers, had never produced anything of particular value, and had never appeared in the news dispatches of any major power. The land itself is the product of ancient and ongoing volcanic activity. Mount Suribachi, the island's most recognizable feature, stands at the southern tip, an extinct volcanic cone roughly 169 meters in height, perfectly conical, brooding and dark, its slopes covered not in green vegetation, but in loose black volcanic rock, and coarse, grey-black sand that shifts underfoot with each step. From the air, The island has an unusual shape, narrow at the south, where Suribachi rises, then gradually widening toward the north, across a rough plateau of broken terrain. It looks, from certain angles, like a pork chop. It looks, from others, like a question mark pressed into the ocean. The ground beneath a man's feet on Iwo Jima does things that ground is not supposed to do. In certain locations, particularly along the lower slopes of Suribachi and across the southern beaches, the earth is warm. Not merely sun-warmed, but heated from below, as if a furnace has been left running just beneath the surface. Steam vents crack open through the black sand without warning, releasing jets of hot vapor that smell powerfully of rotten eggs, of hydrogen sulfide, of geological processes grinding away in the dark. Men who later fought on the island would describe pushing their hands into the sand and feeling the warmth rising through it, an almost surreal sensation in the middle of a battle, as if the island itself were alive and running a fever. The deeper you dig, the hotter it becomes. At certain depths, the ground is hot enough to cook food. It is, in every practical sense, a place the earth is still building and still warning against. Fresh water does not exist on Iwo Jima in any meaningful quantity. There are no rivers, no springs, no lakes, no reliable sources of drinkable water anywhere on the island's approximately 21 square kilometers. The rock beneath the surface is porous volcanic material, unsuited to holding groundwater, and what little rainfall the island receives either evaporates quickly in the heat or filters down through the porous ground before it can be collected. Any garrison stationed on the island, whether Japanese or American, would need to bring water with them, store it carefully, and ration it with discipline. In a climate where temperatures and physical exertion combine to drain a man's body of fluids rapidly, this is not a trivial problem. It is a strategic vulnerability, a logistical constraint, and a source of constant low-grade misery for anyone required to live and work on the island for any extended period of time. The sand is black, not darkened by shadow or distance, but genuinely, deeply black, a coarse volcanic material ground over millennia from the same dark rock that forms the island's interior. It does not behave like sand. It does not pack down under pressure. It does not form a firm surface when wet. It swallows boots. It collapses under the weight of vehicles. It shifts and slides with each footstep, making movement across the beach a physical labor that exhausts men within minutes. The beach itself rises from the waterline in a series of terraces, natural ridges, of this same black volcanic material, shaped by wave action over thousands of years, that create a strange stepped landscape between the water and the interior. There is almost no cover. There is almost no shade. There are no trees along the shoreline, no rocks of sufficient size to shelter behind, no features of any kind that a man caught on that beach in the open could use to protect himself from fire coming from the higher ground inland. Looking at Iwo Jima purely as a piece of real estate, it is difficult to understand why anyone would fight over it. It has no resources, it has no population, it has no agricultural value, no harbor of consequence, no natural beauty, no fresh water. It is hot, malodorous, geologically unstable, and logistically nightmarish to supply. And yet, by the middle of 1944, military planners on both sides of the Pacific War had arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion. This small, ugly, sulfurous rock in the middle of the ocean had become one of the most strategically important pieces of ground in the entire war. The reason had nothing to do with what the island was, and everything to do with where it sat. The mathematics of air power in the Pacific had been changing rapidly since the capture of the Mariana Islands in the summer of 1944. The Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, gave American forces the bases needed to launch the Boeing B-29 Superfortress on bombing missions against the Japanese home islands. The B-29 was the most advanced long-range bomber in existence, capable of carrying enormous bomb loads across distances that had been impossible for any earlier aircraft. But even the B-29 had limits. The round trip from the Marianas to targets in Japan and back covered roughly 3,000 kilometers in each direction. That was a long flight, long enough that mechanical failures, battle damage, fuel exhaustion, and bad weather turned every mission into a calculated gamble, with the lives of the 10 men aboard each aircraft. Iwo Jima sat almost exactly halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo. That geographic accident gave the island its terrible importance. In Japanese hands, the island served as an advanced radar and radio station that gave Tokyo as much as 2 hours of warning before American bombers arrived over the home islands. Japanese fighters and patrol aircraft based on Iwo Jima could intercept B-29 formations on their way north, and had done so repeatedly. The island was, from the American perspective, a thorn embedded in the air corridor between their bomber bases and their targets. A thorn that warned the enemy they were coming, harassed them en route, and complicated the entire strategic bombing campaign. Every mission that flew past Iwo Jima flew past a listening post, a launch pad, and a threat. In American hands, the arithmetic reversed entirely. An airfield on Iwo Jima would allow P-51 Mustang long-range escort fighters to accompany the B-29 formations all the way to Japan and back, dramatically reducing bomber losses to enemy interceptors. More critically, Iwo Jima's airfields could serve as emergency landing strips for damaged B-29s that could not make it back to the Marianas, aircraft that would otherwise be lost at sea, along with their crews. The planners who worked through these numbers in late 1944 understood what they meant in human terms. Every runway on that miserable volcanic rock was a potential lifeline for men flying crippled aircraft over open ocean, men who needed somewhere to put their planes down before they ran out of sky. The Joint Chiefs of Staff approved the operation to capture Iwo Jima in the autumn of 1944. They assigned it the designation Operation Detachment. The name was bureaucratic and forgettable, appropriate for a planning document, but carrying none of the weight of what the operation would actually require. Senior Marine commanders who reviewed the intelligence estimates did not need to look long before they understood that taking this island would be among the most difficult things American forces had attempted in the entire Pacific War. The Japanese had been fortifying the island for months. The terrain favored the defender in almost every respect. The beaches offered no cover. The interior offered no comfort. The ground itself seemed hostile to human life in ways that went beyond the merely military. And yet the bombers were still going down, still disappearing into the Pacific on the long flight home from Japan, with nowhere to land when their engines gave out, or their fuel ran short, or their control surfaces were shot away. The airfields on Iwo Jima were worth fighting for, not as abstractions, not as entries in a strategic ledger, but as the concrete difference between a man surviving a damaged aircraft and a man dying in the ocean, 300 kilometers from the nearest shore. The planners in their offices, looking at their maps and their charts and their loss rate tables, arrived at a conclusion that was rational, defensible, and devastating in its implications. The island had to be taken, whatever the cost turned out to be. They did not yet know what the cost would be. They were about to find out. For most of the war, Iwo Jima had been a backwater, a volcanic speck on the edge of the known world, staffed by a rotating garrison of men who sweated through their uniforms. cursed the sulfur smell, and waited for orders that rarely came. The island sat at the outer edge of Japan's defensive perimeter, close enough to the home islands to be considered interior territory, far enough from the front lines to feel forgotten. The men posted there were not warriors bracing for invasion. They were caretakers of an airstrip, a weather station, a communications relay, unremarkable functions on an unremarkable island. Then, in the summer of 1944, everything changed. The fall of Saipan in July of that year sent a shockwave through the Imperial Japanese High Command that would reshape the entire logic of Pacific defense. Saipan was not simply a loss. It was a rupture, proof that the Americans could reach inside what Japan had considered its inner ring, and a signal that Iwo Jima, sitting between the Marianas and the home islands like a stone in a stream, could no longer be ignored. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo understood the map clearly enough. With American airfields now established in the Marianas, B-29 bombers could already reach the Japanese home islands. But the flight was long, the distance punishing, and without fighter escort, the bombers flew alone. Iwo Jima was the hinge. American possession of the island would bring fighters within range of Tokyo, provide a refuge for damaged aircraft limping back from raids, and eliminate the Japanese early warning station that was already radioing advance notice of incoming American airstrikes. Japanese commanders could read these facts as plainly as their adversaries could. Iwo Jima had to be held, or Japan's cities would burn without obstacle. The island that had been a quiet posting was about to become the most heavily fortified piece of real estate in the Pacific. The man chosen to command this transformation was not selected arbitrarily. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was among the most experienced and intellectually serious officers in the Imperial Japanese Army. He had served as Deputy Chief of Staff in China, commanded cavalry, and spent time in the United States during the 1930s as a military attaché, an experience that left him with a sober, unsentimental respect for American industrial power and military capacity. He held no illusions about what his country was capable of producing versus what the Americans were capable of deploying. He understood, perhaps more clearly than most of his contemporaries, that Japan could no longer win the Pacific War in any traditional sense. What it could do was make the cost of victory so steep that the Americans might pause, negotiate, or accept terms short of unconditional surrender. It was within that narrow logic that Kuribayashi arrived on Iwo Jima in the early summer of 1944, stepped onto its black volcanic sand, smelled the sulfur rising from the earth beneath his boots, and began to think. What he saw would have discouraged most commanders. The island was roughly 8 square miles of volcanic rock and ash, barely above sea level at its widest point, dominated at the southern end by the looming cone of Mount Suribachi and flattening into a broken plateau further north. There were no natural harbors, no rivers, no reliable sources of fresh water. The terrain was ugly and inhospitable, and the garrison Kuribayashi inherited was understrength, under-equipped, and accustomed to garrison routine rather than combat readiness. He also understood, with painful clarity, that no significant naval or air reinforcement would ever reach this island. The Imperial Japanese Navy no longer had the surface strength or the fuel reserves to contest American sea control around the Marianas. Whatever Kuribayashi built on Iwo Jima, he would build it with what he had, and then he and his men would die with it. This was not despair, it was planning. Kuribayashi's genius, if that word belongs anywhere in the architecture of mass suffering, lay in his willingness to discard the conventional doctrine that had already cost Japan so many islands. The standard Japanese defensive playbook called for meeting an amphibious landing at the water's edge, mass the infantry on the beach, counterattack immediately, hurl the invaders back into the sea with a combination of firepower and ferocity before they could consolidate. It was a doctrine born of confidence in Japanese fighting spirit, and it had failed catastrophically, island after island, as American naval gunfire and air support obliterated beach defenders before their feet were wet. At Tarawa, at Roy Namur, at Saipan, the pattern repeated. Japan rushed to the shore and was shattered on the shore. Kuribayashi refused to repeat it. His plan was radical in its simplicity and brutal in its implications. He would not defend the beaches. He would let the Americans land. He would let them come ashore in their thousands, with their vehicles and supplies and medical teams, crowding the black sand below the terraced shoreline, and then, only then, would he open fire from positions they could not see, could not easily target, and could not quickly destroy. The Americans would be caught in the open, on terrain that worked against them, being struck by weapons whose exact positions would remain invisible beneath the earth. The beach would become not a defensive line, but a killing ground, and the killing ground would be run from underground. The tunnel network was the heart of everything. Kuribayashi ordered construction to begin almost immediately after his arrival, driving thousands of soldiers and Korean laborers to carve passages through the volcanic rock day and night through the second half of 1944 and into the opening weeks of 1945. The work was agonizing. The rock was hard where it was not crumbling, and the heat vents that ran through the island's interior made certain tunneling locations nearly unbearable. Men worked in air so thick with sulfur and volcanic heat that shifts had to be kept short to prevent casualties from the conditions themselves. But the work continued. By the time the American fleet appeared on the horizon, more than 17 kilometers of tunnels had been completed beneath the island's surface. Passages connecting bunkers to artillery positions, to ammunition stores, to hospital chambers. All of it deep enough that even sustained naval bombardment would rattle the walls without breaking them. The fortifications above ground were equally deliberate. More than 700 concrete blockhouses, pillboxes, and gun emplacements were built or carved from the existing rock, each positioned to cover the approaches to other positions, so that attacking any single point would expose the attacker to fire from multiple others. Artillery and mortar positions were registered on the beaches before the Americans ever arrived, the coordinates already calculated, the rounds already stacked. Machine gun nests were built with overlapping fields of fire. Nothing about the island's defenses was accidental. Kuribayashi walked the terrain repeatedly, adjusting positions, examining angles, thinking through every phase of the battle as if he were playing a very long, very terrible game of chess, one in which he knew he could not win, but was determined to make as costly as possible to his opponent. His orders to his garrison were unlike anything most of his officers had heard before. There would be no banzai charges, no theatrical last rushes into enemy lines, the kind of mass assault that had come to define and to hollow out Japanese defensive battles elsewhere in the Pacific. Kuribayashi forbade them explicitly. Each man was expected to kill at least 10 Americans before he died. Each man was to hold his position, use his ammunition with discipline, remain concealed until the correct moment, and refuse to die cheaply. These were not the orders of a commander who worshipped sacrifice for its own sake. They were the orders of a man who understood that dramatic, costly gestures shortened the battle and handed the Americans ground they had not paid for. Kuribayashi wanted them to pay for every meter. He also prepared his men psychologically in ways that reveal a commander who understood morale as clearly as he understood fortifications. He told them plainly that no relief was coming. He told them they would not leave the island alive. He did not dress this in euphemism or false patriotic comfort. He stated it as a military fact and asked his men to accept it as their condition of service. In letters to his family during this period, Kuribayashi wrote with a quiet tenderness that sits in sharp contrast to the machinery of destruction he was assembling around himself. He wrote about his children, about the garden at his home, about small domestic details that a man thinks of when he understands he is leaving them behind for good. He was not a fanatic. He was a professional who had accepted an impossible assignment and intended to execute it with everything he had. By the time the new year of 1945 turned, the garrison on Iwo Jima had swelled to more than 20,000 men. The tunnels were finished, or nearly finished. The guns were in place. The ammunition was cached. The coordinates were calculated. Kuribayashi had built something that had never quite existed before in the Pacific War. A defense specifically engineered not to throw the Americans back, but to absorb them, grind them, and drain them until the cost of continuing became, in his calculation, greater than the Americans could bear. Whether his calculation was correct would be answered in the weeks ahead. But in early February of 1945, as his sentries reported the distant shapes of American warships gathering on the southern horizon, Kuribayashi's island was as ready as any commander could have made it. It smelled like hell, sat like a fist in the middle of the Pacific, and waited. Beneath the sulphurous crust of Iwo Jima, in the months before any American boot touched its black sand, something extraordinary was happening. Men were disappearing into the earth. Not in defeat, not in panic, but by design, by the precise, methodical will of one general who had studied his enemy carefully enough to understand that the only way to make this island cost the Americans everything was to make the island itself the weapon. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had arrived on Iwo Jima in the summer of 1944, carrying a vision that no subordinate fully understood at first, and that the Americans would not understand until it was already too late. He looked at the rock and the heat and the honeycombed volcanic geology beneath his feet, and he saw not a liability, but a gift. The earth here was soft enough to dig, hard enough to hold its shape, and deep enough to swallow an entire army. He intended to use every meter of it. The work began in earnest through the second half of 1944, as thousands of Japanese soldiers and conscripted laborers set to carving passages through the island's volcanic rock. The tools were simple: pickaxes, shovels, hand drills, and in places where the terrain permitted, small explosive charges, carefully detonated, to open chambers without collapsing the fragile ceiling above. Progress was measured not in kilometers, but in the agonizing patience of men chipping stone by lamplight, in temperatures that hovered well above comfortable in the volcanic tunnels, where natural heat vents pushed warm air through the passages, like the breath of something alive beneath the ground. Many of the laborers working the deepest sections could not remain underground for long stretches without rotating to the surface to recover from the heat and the thin, sulfur-tainted air. Yet the work did not stop. Kuribayashi kept it moving through the night as well as the day, understanding that time was the one resource the Americans were also watching. What emerged from those months of labor was not merely a series of hiding places. It was a functioning underground city. The tunnel network eventually stretched to more than 17 kilometers of connected passages running beneath the island at multiple depths. Some corridors no wider than a man's shoulders, others opening into vaulted chambers large enough to hold dozens of soldiers. Command posts were built at depth, fortified with thick walls of volcanic rock and reinforced with timber and steel where available. Artillery positions were constructed inside the rock itself, their firing ports cut at precise angles so that guns could deliver fire across the beaches and the approaches, without the muzzle ever being visible to an observer on the surface. Medical chambers were hollowed out and stocked with supplies, designed to function as underground field hospitals when the surface became untenable. Storage rooms held ammunition, food, and water reserves, calculated to sustain the garrison for months of siege. What Kuribayashi had built was not a place to hide. It was a place from which to fight indefinitely. The passages were engineered with interlocking logic. A position on the surface was never isolated. It was always connected by tunnel to at least one other position, and in many cases to several. This meant that when an American unit attacked a bunker or a cave entrance, the defenders could withdraw through the earth, resurface elsewhere, and bring fire onto the Americans from an entirely different angle without ever exposing themselves to the assault that had just driven them back. From the outside, it appeared that a position had been taken. From inside the tunnel system, the defenders had simply moved through the wall. This was the core of Kuribayashi's tactical genius. He designed his defenses not to hold any single point, but to ensure that no single point could ever truly be held against him either. The island was the fortress, and its walls ran underground. Kuribayashi's battle orders circulated through his garrison with a clarity and discipline that set him apart from any conventional reading of how Japanese forces were expected to fight. He was explicit on the subject of the Banzai charge, that tradition of massed frontal assault that had given Japanese infantry a reputation for ferocity at the cost of catastrophic losses and negligible tactical gain. He forbade it, not as a suggestion or a preference, but as a direct order binding every officer and every man under his command. He had watched what Banzai charges had accomplished elsewhere in the Pacific, and he had drawn the correct conclusion. They were a release of morale, not a use of it. A garrison that spent itself in one night of charging across open ground gave the Americans a single terrible experience and then ceased to exist. A garrison that refused to charge, that stayed hidden and fired carefully and made the Americans pay for every meter, could inflict casualties the Americans had not planned for and could not absorb without consequence. His written orders to the garrison were meticulous documents. They addressed not only tactics but psychology, the mental frame in which each soldier was to understand his role and his death. Kuribayashi made no false promises. He told his men that reinforcements were unlikely. He told them that naval support was unavailable. He acknowledged that the island would, in all probability, eventually fall. What he asked of them was not hope of victory in the conventional sense, but commitment to a different kind of victory, the slow, grinding extraction of the maximum cost from the Americans, measured in blood and time. Each man, he instructed, was to kill at least 10 of the enemy before he died, not as a boast, as a calculation. He was building an arithmetic of attrition, and he wanted his men to understand they were the instruments of it. The garrison numbered well over 20,000 men by the time the American fleet appeared on the horizon. They were not concentrated on the beaches waiting to be destroyed by naval gunfire. They were dispersed through the tunnel network, assigned to positions in depth, organized into mutually supporting nodes of resistance that ran from the southern slopes of Mount Suribachi all the way to the rocky cliffs of the island's northern tip. The strongest fortifications were not where the Americans expected to find them. The beaches were defended. The landing force would suffer terribly in the first hours. But the real mass of Japanese firepower was sited further inland, in the rocky central plateau, where the terrain was most difficult and where the tunnels ran deepest and widest. Kuribayashi had positioned his strongest defenses where the Americans would have to go eventually, ensuring the worst fighting would come not at the beginning, but after the invaders believed they were making progress. Every gun emplacement had been carefully pre-sighted across the terrain it was intended to cover. Mortar crews had walked the approaches, and calculated their fire tables before the Americans arrived. Machine gun positions were positioned not at the obvious high points that naval gunfire would target, but in defiladed angles, placed to deliver fire across the lines of advance rather than down them, so that an entire column of Marines might be caught in the beaten zone of a gun they could not see firing from a direction they had not expected. The planning was not improvised under pressure. It had been drawn up, revised, and drilled for months. Kuribayashi had even established a system of hand signals and run a communication between positions, so that the loss of telephone wire, which he correctly anticipated would happen immediately, would not sever his command network. He had planned for the chaos of battle, and he had planned around it. Among the garrison, a particular tone prevailed. It was not the fervor of men expecting to survive, nor quite the resignation of men who had abandoned all will. It was something more composed and more disturbing, a kind of settled determination that came from a commander who had been honest with his soldiers about what lay ahead and had given them a framework in which their deaths would carry meaning. Kuribayashi had written poems to his family in Japan. He maintained a correspondence with his children that was warm and clear-eyed, and showed no trace of the theatrical self-sacrifice that colored so much Japanese military communication of the period. He was a practical man who had concluded that practicality required him to prepare his command to die well, in the tactical sense, slowly, expensively, and without wasted passion. The tunnels also served another function that Kuribayashi understood intuitively. They would be psychologically devastating to an enemy trained to see, and therefore to fight. American Marines had trained for assaulting beaches and taking terrain. They had trained to identify targets, destroy them, and advance. The tunnel system would deny them all of that. Positions taken would come back to life. Areas cleared would become dangerous again. Men killed in morning assaults would seem to be replaced by nightfall. The island would appear to regenerate its defenders, as if feeding them up from the rock itself, because in a sense it was. No amount of courage or firepower prepared a man to fight an enemy who lived inside the ground beneath him, who could be anywhere and nowhere at once, whose fortress had no visible walls, because the walls were the earth itself. By the time the calendar turned to 1945 and the American bombardment began, the underground kingdom was essentially complete. The surface of Iwo Jima still looked to an aircraft passing overhead or a naval officer reviewing reconnaissance photographs like a blasted, barren rock. Difficult terrain, heavily armed, but exposed. The reality below was something those photographs could not show, a vast, patient, interlocking network of stone and steel and human will, fully stocked, fully manned, and waiting. Kuribayashi had accomplished something rarely seen in modern warfare. He had rendered the decisive terrain invisible. He had hidden the battle inside the island and left only the invitation on the surface. The Americans were coming, and the ground itself was ready to receive them. While Kuribayashi's men carved their tunnels deeper into the rock, thousands of miles to the east, another kind of preparation was underway. Across the training grounds of Hawaii and the sun-baked atolls of the Marianas, young Americans were rehearsing the most dangerous choreography in the world, the amphibious assault. They practiced loading into landing craft and crossing open water under simulated fire. They ran up beaches and threw themselves into the dirt and got up and ran again. Some of them had done this before, at Saipan, or Tinian, or Peleliu, and they carried those memories like weight in their packs. Others were new, fresh from the continental United States, still adjusting to the heat and the unfamiliar weight of a rifle in serious hands. All of them, in the closing months of 1944, were being shaped into a single instrument, and that instrument had a name. It was called the 5th Amphibious Corps, and it was being built to take an 8-square-mile island that most of them had never heard of. The Corps itself was a command structure rather than a single fighting unit, a headquarters that coordinated the efforts of multiple Marine divisions operating under a shared operational plan. At its core were two assault divisions, the 4th Marine Division and the 5th Marine Division. The 4th had earned its reputation the hard way, fighting through the Marshall Islands and the bloody Mariana Campaign. Its Marines were experienced, hardened, and under no illusions about what Pacific combat looked like. The 5th Marine Division was newer as a formation, but drew heavily on veterans, men who had been through other fights and were reassigned to give the division backbone. Held in reserve, available to be committed if the assault required it, was the 3rd Marine Division, veterans of Bougainville and Guam, waiting at sea with the knowledge that their moment might come at any hour. Together, these three divisions represented more than 70,000 men, one of the largest concentrations of Marine Corps fighting power ever assembled for a single operation. The man ultimately responsible for this force carried a nickname that told you nearly everything about his temperament. General Holland Smith was called Howlin' Mad, and he had not discouraged the label. He was volcanic in personality, blunt to the edge of rudeness, and constitutionally incapable of patience when he believed timidity was wasting lives or losing ground. He had built much of the doctrine that made American amphibious warfare effective in the Pacific, had overseen brutal fights at Tarawa and Saipan, and had controversially relieved an army general during the latter campaign, in a move that sent tremors through inter-service relationships for months afterward. By the time Iwo Jima was being planned, Smith was in his early 60s and had accumulated enough hard-won understanding of Pacific assault operations to fill a textbook, though his preferred mode of expression was considerably less academic. He believed in hitting hard, hitting fast, and not stopping, and he believed the men under his command were capable of extraordinary things if properly led and properly supported. Directly commanding the landing force on the ground was Major General Harry Schmidt, who led the 5th Amphibious Corps at the operational level. Schmidt was in many ways the counterpoint to Holland Smith, quieter, more methodical, the kind of officer who worked through problems systematically rather than by force of will. He had commanded the 4th Marine Division during the Marianas Campaign and understood intimately what his men would face when they crossed a defended beach. Schmidt and his staff spent long weeks in the autumn and winter of 1944 studying every piece of available intelligence about Iwo Jima, aerial photographs, submarine reconnaissance reports, the accounts of pilots who had flown over the island during preparatory strikes. The picture that emerged from all that analysis was not a reassuring one. The island was being fortified at a pace and scale that American planners found genuinely alarming, even by Pacific theater standards. Intelligence briefings held aboard ships and in base command centers delivered their conclusions without softening the edges. Marine officers were told that Iwo Jima was estimated to hold a garrison of between 18,000 and 21,000 Japanese troops, a figure that would prove, if anything, slightly conservative. They were told the island was heavily fortified, that the fortifications were subterranean and largely resistant to aerial bombing, and that the beaches, for all their apparent accessibility, were covered by interlocking fields of fire from positions that could not easily be identified from the air. Experienced officers sat in those briefings and felt the weight of what they were hearing settle over the room. The men who had fought at Peleliu, where a similarly fortified Japanese defense had been far more costly and far longer than planners anticipated, heard those briefings and recognized the pattern. Iwo Jima, they suspected, would be something like Peleliu, but larger in every dimension that mattered. The training itself was as realistic as it could be made. Marines practiced beach landings on shores chosen for their physical resemblance to what reconnaissance suggested the black sand beaches would feel like underfoot. They rehearsed the specific problem of moving through soft, yielding ground that would resist tracked vehicles and swallow boots. They trained with flamethrowers and demolition charges, the tools that experience in the Pacific had proven most effective against fortified cave positions. Medical personnel ran drills for mass casualty situations, because the casualty estimates being circulated at the planning level were high enough that the medical system needed to be prepared, not merely for a difficult battle, but for something of a different order altogether. The men doing this training were not ignorant of what the numbers implied. They could do arithmetic. They trained harder because of it. Below the level of generals and colonels, among the platoon sergeants and the rifle squads, the atmosphere in those final weeks before embarkation was a particular kind of quiet. Veterans processed what was coming through experience. They had their own private reckoning with fear, and had long since arrived at whatever accommodation with it allowed them to function. The new men processed it differently, through bravado sometimes, through silence more often, through letters home that tried to say something true without frightening the people who would read them. Chaplains held services that drew larger congregations than usual. Men wrote down addresses and pressed them into the hands of friends, an unspoken acknowledgement of something neither party was willing to name directly. There was humor, the gallows kind, and there was the professional focus that good training instills. The knowledge that staying alive in a fight depends on doing the small things correctly, keeping your weapon clean, knowing your sector, trusting the man beside you. The logistics of the operation were staggering in their own right. Hundreds of ships had to be loaded in a precise sequence, because the order in which supplies were loaded determined the order in which they could be unloaded, and the order of unloading under fire on a contested beach had to match the operational timeline exactly. Ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, fuel, spare parts, engineering equipment, all of it had to move from depots across thousands of miles of ocean and arrive in the right quantity at the right moment at an island 8 square miles in area with no natural harbor. The naval logistical staffs who worked on these problems were performing a kind of arithmetic that required getting every figure right, because the margin for error when the first waves hit the beach would be essentially zero. In early February of 1945, the fleet began to assemble. Ship by ship, convoy by convoy, the Armada gathered off the Marianas and took shape as a formation of almost inconceivable scale. Troop transports, landing ships, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, aircraft carriers, more than 800 vessels in total, moving together toward a point on the map that most of their sailors and marines could only locate by squinting at a chart. The scale of it was its own kind of message, a statement about industrial and organizational power, about what a nation committed to a war across an ocean could produce and project across the water. The men aboard those ships looked at the armada around them and understood that they were part of something enormous. That understanding brought its own form of comfort and its own form of dread. Steaming northwest through the Pacific winter, the fleet carried with it the accumulated weight of months of planning, weeks of training, years of war. The men standing watches on deck at night could see the running lights of other ships stretching to the horizon in every direction, a moving city on the water. Below decks, men slept in stacked bunks, wrote letters, played cards, cleaned weapons, stared at overhead pipes and thought their private thoughts. Some of them knew veterans of Tarawa and Peleliu who had described the moment the landing ramp dropped and the world outside compressed into noise and terror and the need to move forward. Some of them had been at those places themselves. The island ahead was still days away, and for now there was only the rolling of the ship and the sound of engines and the ocean passing beneath them in the dark. What none of them fully knew, what the best intelligence had suggested, but not confirmed, was that beneath the island they were approaching, a general had built something that the history of amphibious warfare had not yet encountered in quite this form. The aerial photographs showed gun emplacements and beach obstacles and vehicle tracks. They did not show 17 kilometers of tunnel. They did not show the interconnected chambers, the pre-registered artillery coordinates, the disciplined garrison that had been ordered not to waste itself on the beach but to wait and wait and wait until the moment was exactly right. The men on those ships were bringing overwhelming force, undeniable courage, and the most powerful amphibious capability in history. They were also sailing towards something they did not yet have the means to fully understand, and they would not understand it until they were already ashore, already inside it, already paying for that knowledge, in the only currency the island would accept. The ships arrived in the dark. More than 400 vessels of the United States Navy had assembled in the waters north and west of the Mariana Islands, their hulls low in the water under the weight of shells, powder charges, and the machinery of modern destruction. Battleships that had survived Pearl Harbor, cruisers that had dueled in the straits around Guadalcanal, destroyers, minesweepers, gunboats, a fleet assembled over 3 years of hard-won Pacific experience, pointed now at a single 8-square-mile target that sat in the sea like a grey fist. The men who would ride these ships to war had studied the reconnaissance photographs, had read the intelligence summaries, had traced the contour lines of Iwo Jima on acetate overlays under fluorescent light. They knew, in the way that professional sailors come to know things before a major operation, that what lay ahead would not be routine. On the 16th of February 1945, the guns began to speak. The request from the Marine commanders had been unambiguous. General Holland Smith and his staff had studied the available intelligence, consulted with planners who had been through Tarawa and Peleliu, and arrived at a number: 10 days. 10 days of sustained, concentrated naval gunfire before a single Marine stepped into a landing craft. 10 days to crack bunkers, collapse tunnel entrances, destroy artillery positions, sever communications between defensive zones, and generally make the island as dead as possible before the assault waves crossed the line of departure. It was not an extravagant request. It was a calculation rooted in blood, in the memory of every beach where the pre-invasion bombardment had been cut short and men had died in the gaps. The Marines had seen what happened when naval gunfire was rationed by the clock rather than by results, and they were asking, as clearly as the chain of command allowed, for enough time to do the job properly. They did not get it. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the Joint Expeditionary Force, approved 3 days. 3 days beginning the 16th of February, 3 days ending on the eve of D-Day, the 19th. The reasons were not arbitrary. Turner was managing an operation of enormous logistical complexity, with schedules interlocked across multiple commands, resupply windows constrained by weather and fuel, and the larger strategic timetable of the Pacific campaign pressing from above. There was also genuine uncertainty about how much difference additional days of bombardment would actually make against an enemy who had, as the intelligence photos increasingly suggested, gone underground. Turner was an experienced and intelligent officer, but the decision to compress the bombardment from 10 days to 3 would echo through every hour of the 36 days that followed, measured not in nautical miles, but in bodies. On the first day, the weather turned against the fleet. Low cloud and reduced visibility forced the cancellation and postponement of several fire missions, compressing an already compressed schedule further. The battleships and cruisers worked through what windows the weather allowed. their 16-inch and 8-inch guns sending shells that weighed as much as a small automobile screaming toward the island. From a distance, the spectacle was almost beyond description. The concussive thunder rolling across the water, the columns of black and grey smoke rising from the island's northern plateau, the occasional orange bloom of a secondary explosion when a shell found something volatile. For the sailors watching from their stations, it looked like the island was being destroyed. For the spotters in observation aircraft circling above, the picture was considerably less encouraging. The spotters filed their reports in careful, professional language, but the meaning beneath the language was hard to miss. Targets that had been identified from reconnaissance photographs as artillery positions or command bunkers were being struck, sometimes struck again, and then, when the smoke cleared and the photographs were developed, were found to be essentially intact. The volcanic rock of Iwo Jima, the same dense, compressed stone that had been blasted and carved by Kuribayashi's laborers for more than 7 months, was proving resistant to naval shellfire in ways that flat-topped coral atolls were not. Shells that would have obliterated a surface emplacement were detonating on the earth above tunnels and leaving the tunnels themselves untouched. The island was absorbing the bombardment the way a deep body of water absorbs a thrown stone, with a splash at the surface and almost nothing below. On the second day, the Navy attempted close-in fire support, bringing destroyers and gunboats within a few hundred meters of the shore to engage beach defenses at near point-blank range. The results were significant, but the cost was immediate. The Japanese garrison, under strict orders from Kuribayashi to reveal as few positions as possible before the actual landing, broke discipline at key points and opened fire on the close-in vessels. Several gunboats were hit, casualties were taken, and the exchange provided American intelligence officers with some of the clearest information yet about the density and placement of Japanese coastal weapons. It was valuable intelligence. It was also a warning that the defenses were not only intact, but waiting, patient, positioned, and holding their fire for a target worth shooting at. The target Kuribayashi had in mind was not a destroyer. It was a beach crowded with Marines. The ammunition expenditure across the 3 days was staggering by any measure. Hundreds of tons of shells had been directed at the island against more than 700 identified targets, and aerial bombardment had added to the weight of metal falling on the rock. Strike after strike, mission after mission, the island continued to burn and smoke in ways that looked, from a distance, like annihilation. But when the Navy's own after-action assessment was quietly compiled in the hours before D-Day, the numbers told a sobering story. Of the roughly 700 targets on the master fire plan, a fraction had been assessed as destroyed. The majority were listed as damaged, suppressed, or unconfirmed. And those assessments were themselves optimistic, made by men working from aerial photographs of a volcanic island, where distinguishing a destroyed position from an intact one was genuinely difficult when everything was already the color of ash. Marine commanders pushed back. In the hours before the landing, requests went up through channels for additional fire, for delay, for at least one more day of bombardment before the assault. The Navy's response was shaped by the operational schedule, by fuel states, by the window of favorable conditions that was already narrowing. The landing would proceed as planned. The Marines would have whatever fire support could be arranged on the day itself, with naval gunfire lifting as the first waves approached the beach, and resuming once the troops were ashore and targets could be called in. It was the system working as it was designed to work. For the men who would be in the first waves, the system's limitations were about to become personal. There was one particularly bitter dimension to the bombardment's inadequacy that only became clear in retrospect, though some planners sensed it at the time. The 3-day window had focused necessarily on identified targets, positions visible in photographs, coordinates derived from observation, the known gun emplacements, and blockhouses that appeared on the targeting maps. But Kuribayashi's genius, the quality that made him different from every Japanese commander the Americans had faced before, was that so much of what he had built was genuinely invisible. The tunnels did not appear in aerial photographs. The interconnected cave systems, the artillery pieces mounted behind steel doors that could be rolled shut between firing, the mortar pits sighted to fire from defilade. These were not on the targeting maps because they could not be seen. The bombardment was largely destroying what could be found, and largely missing what could not. And what could not be found was most of the garrison. Rear Admiral William Blandy, commanding the bombardment force, did what he could with what he had. He was a capable officer working within real constraints, and he understood that his ships had not achieved what the Marines needed. When he met with correspondents in the days before the landing, he was careful in his language, measured in his assessments. He did not claim the island had been neutralized. He said that the bombardment had done damage, that it had been conducted under difficult conditions, and that the landing force would have to do the rest. It was an honest summary. It was not what the Marines wanted to hear on the eve of the most heavily defended amphibious objective in the Pacific War. The night before D-Day, the fleet settled into its positions, and the men who would go ashore tried to sleep, or eat, or write letters, or simply lie in their bunks and think about what the morning would bring. The intelligence briefings had warned them the island would be costly. The veterans among them, the men who had come through Tarawa or Saipan or the Cape at Gloucester, carried a private knowledge that official optimism could not quite cover. The knowledge that when the guns stop and the smoke clears, what waits on the other side is not rubble and silence, but men who want to kill you, and who have been waiting patiently for days while you announced your intentions with every shell you fired. Beneath the black sand, beneath the volcanic rock, beneath the sulphurous ground that smelled of the earth's own heat, Kuribayashi's garrison had been waiting in the dark. 3 days of bombardment had not changed that. When the ramps went down on the morning of the 19th of February, 1945, they were still waiting. Before dawn on the 19th of February, 1945, the Pacific Ocean around Iwo Jima glowed with the fires of the most powerful naval armada ever assembled for a single assault in the theater. More than 800 vessels of every kind, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, and landing craft, ringed the island in a crescent of steel and smoke. The men below decks had been awake for hours, many of them unable to eat, sitting with their gear and their thoughts in the low red lighting of the troop compartments. Some wrote final letters, some prayed, some simply stared at the bulkheads and listened to the concussive thunder of the pre-dawn bombardment rolling through the hull of the ship like a slow, relentless heartbeat. They had been told the naval guns and carrier aircraft would have softened what lay ahead. They had been told to expect a difficult fight, but one that 3 days of sustained fire should have made survivable. What no briefing could adequately prepare them for was the island itself, and the man who had spent months building a killing machine inside it, waiting patiently for exactly this morning. The bombardment intensified at first light. Carrier aircraft swept low over the island in coordinated waves, dropping bombs and firing rockets across the beaches and the terraced ground behind them. Battleships moved to close range, their guns shaking the air for kilometers in every direction. To any observer watching from the fleet, the island appeared to be receiving a punishment beyond anything living could endure. Plumes of black volcanic soil and grey smoke rose hundreds of meters into the morning sky. The southern cone of Mount Suribachi, visible at the island's tip, disappeared periodically behind curtains of fire and debris, Officers on observation decks scanned the shoreline through binoculars and saw what looked like total devastation: craters, collapsed terrain, the apparent wreckage of defensive positions along the beach. It looked, from a distance, like an island that had been thoroughly neutralized. It was not. Below the surface, in chambers and corridors carved from solid rock, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurubayashi's garrison waited in the dark, untouched, listening to the bombardment pass harmlessly overhead. The first waves of landing craft formed up and began their run toward the shore at approximately 9 o'clock in the morning. There were nearly 9,000 Marines in those initial waves, organized into tight assault columns that stretched back across the water toward the fleet. The landing craft moved at the deliberate pace of machinery, bouncing through the light chop, engines grinding steadily forward. As they crossed the line of departure and began the final approach, something happened. Or rather, something did not happen. There was no fire from the beach, no tracers arcing out across the water, no mortar rounds walking toward the approaching boats. The island, having absorbed hours of bombardment, sat in an almost supernatural quiet. A few men later recalled thinking that perhaps the shelling had worked after all. Perhaps this would be different from what the intelligence officers had warned. The silence stretched all the way to the moment the ramps dropped and the first Marines stepped onto the black sand of Iwo Jima. What they stepped into was not ground in any ordinary sense. Iwo Jima's beaches are composed of volcanic ash and pulverized pumice, a fine, dark granule that behaves nothing like the packed sand of a normal shoreline. A man's boot sank into it with each step, sometimes ankle deep, sometimes deeper, pulling backward with a soft, sucking resistance that burned the legs within minutes. Men who had trained on the beaches of Hawaii and the Marianas had never encountered anything like it. Squads that expected to sprint across the beach and find cover found themselves laboring through the sand at a fraction of their intended speed, legs working hard just to move forward at all. The beach itself was not flat. It rose in a series of natural volcanic terraces, steep, crumbling ridges of loose black material that rose 2 to 3 meters above the waterline and then repeated, offering not cover but a series of obstacles that funneled men into compressed groups. There was nowhere to go except forward, and forward was uphill, through sand that refused to hold footprints. The vehicles and equipment arriving with the assault waves fared even worse. Amphibious tractors, the tracked vehicles designed to carry men and supplies from the water across the beach and into the interior, ground forward onto the sand and immediately began to struggle. Their tracks, designed for packed terrain, churned uselessly through the loose volcanic material, spinning and digging in rather than gaining purchase. Jeeps and supply vehicles that followed were stopped almost immediately. Ammunition, water, and medical supplies piled up at the waterline, unable to move inland, creating dense concentrations of men and material in the precise area Kuribayashi had planned to saturate with fire. The marine engineers who had trained to clear beach obstacles and build rapid supply lanes found themselves wrestling with a terrain that defeated their equipment before a single Japanese soldier had fired a shot. The beach was not just a landing zone, it was a trap, and its walls were made of sand. For roughly 20 to 30 minutes after the first waves landed, the silence held. Men pushed inland as far as the terrain would allow, struggling up the terraces, beginning to spread across the base of Suribachi to the south and toward the airfield plateau to the north. The beaches behind them filled steadily with successive waves. More Marines, more equipment, more men bunching together in the narrow strip between the water and the terraces. Commanders watching from offshore observed the build-up and registered a cautious optimism. The beach was crowded, but intact. The assault was proceeding. Then, at a moment no survivor would later be able to pinpoint with precision, the island opened its eyes. Kuribayashi's orders had been explicit, and they had been rehearsed. His officers knew exactly how crowded the beaches needed to be before the signal was given. The garrison had waited through the bombardment. They had waited through the first landings. They had waited through the silence that followed, counting minutes, watching the Marines fill the killing ground below. And then, on a signal passed through the tunnel network, every concealed position on the island opened fire at once. Artillery pieces firing from inside caves. Mortars registered on the beach terraces. Heavy machine guns embedded in the high ground above the landing zones. Rocket batteries that had survived 3 days of naval bombardment without damage. The fire did not build gradually. It arrived all at once, from multiple directions simultaneously, as if the island itself had exhaled. The transformation was instantaneous and total. Men who had been moving cautiously forward one moment were diving for cover the next. But there was no cover. The terraces that had slowed their movement now trapped them. The volcanic sand that had swallowed their boots now refused to let them dig foxholes quickly enough to matter. Every scoop of loose material collapsed back into the hole almost as fast as it was removed. Landing craft arriving at the shore drove into a wall of fire and smoke. Vehicles burst into flame at the waterline. Radios were destroyed before messages could be sent. Medical corpsmen began working immediately, crawling from man to man through the chaos, exposing themselves to fire with a steady, deliberate courage that would become one of the defining qualities of the battle. Within minutes of the first shots, the beaches of Iwo Jima had been transformed from an organized military operation into a scene of raw, howling disorder. What saved the assault from complete catastrophe in those first terrible minutes was not any single decision or any piece of equipment. It was the training and the character of the Marines themselves. Units that lost officers improvised around sergeants and corporals. Men who had never met each other found themselves moving together toward the same objective for no other reason than that it was the right direction to go. Small groups discovered gaps between the Japanese fields of fire, narrow corridors where the angles of the fortifications created brief shadows, and pushed through them with everything they had. They moved not because it was safe, but because staying still on the beach was demonstrably worse. The instinct to advance, drilled into every Marine through months of preparation, expressed itself under conditions that no training evolution had replicated, and in that expression, the entire operation found its forward momentum. The fire from Mount Suribachi was particularly severe in the southern sector. The volcanic cone rose almost 170 meters above the beach and provided Kuribayashi's gunners with a commanding view of the entire landing zone below. Positions on Suribachi's slopes could fire down onto the beaches at angles that no amount of lateral movement could escape. Marines landing in the southern zones were caught between fire from the mountain above and fire from the prepared positions inland. Casualties in these sectors mounted with terrible speed. Units that had landed with full strength found themselves at a fraction of that strength within an hour, not because of flight or failure, but simply because the geometry of the ground gave the enemy an advantage that courage alone could not immediately overcome. Suribachi loomed over everything, and every man on the southern beaches understood in their bones that the mountain had to fall before the situation could change. By midday, the situation on the beaches had stabilized into something that could be called, with grim charity, a contested perimeter. The Marines had not been thrown back into the sea, but neither had they broken through to the interior with the speed the operational plan had anticipated. Thousands of men were ashore. Thousands of meters of the beachhead were held. And the cost of those meters, measured in the men lying still on the black sand, in the vehicles burning at the waterline, in the steady, unbroken stream of casualties being loaded onto landing craft for evacuation to the hospital ships offshore, was already shocking to those keeping the counts. Commanders ashore and afloat revised their estimates upward, trying to project what the next days would cost at this rate. The numbers they arrived at were difficult to believe, and they would nonetheless prove to be underestimates. The 19th of February 1945 ended with the Marines holding a narrow, contested strip of volcanic ground, and with Iwo Jima still overwhelmingly in Japanese hands. The 3 days of bombardment that had been deemed sufficient had not been sufficient. The beach that had looked vulnerable from the maps had proven, in the flesh, to be a killing ground of extraordinary efficiency, and the garrison that was supposed to have been weakened, disrupted, perhaps even broken by naval gunfire, had waited in its tunnels and emerged intact to fight a battle on precisely its own terms. What lay ahead, the grinding advance through the island's interior, the fortified ridgelines, the invisible enemy, the weeks of attrition, had not yet begun. This was only the opening. The men who were still alive on the beach as night fell knew it, and the knowledge settled over the island with the darkness, quiet and absolute. The sound came first. Not the sound of war, as Hollywood had taught a generation of Americans to imagine it, but something far worse, the sound of men dying, before most of them had even taken their first step on dry land. The beaches of Iwo Jima on the 19th of February 1945 were black with volcanic sand, a fine powder that clung to everything and swallowed boots up to the ankle. The first waves of Marines had hit the shore in relative silence, their landing craft grinding onto the beach with that peculiar grinding noise that meant the ramp was about to drop. For perhaps 90 seconds, there was only the crashing of the surf and the roar of the engines and the shouts of officers trying to organize men into some semblance of tactical formation on a beach that offered no cover whatsoever. Then General Kuribayashi gave the order, and the volcano answered. The artillery began as a distant sound from somewhere inland, a low whistle that became a shriek, and then a crash that threw sand and men into the air. The mortars followed, raining down in careful patterns, each explosion sending up clouds of black ash that made it impossible to see more than 20 meters in any direction. The machine guns opened up from the terraced heights overlooking the beach, and suddenly the thin lines of Marines who had managed to organize themselves on the sand found themselves in a killing gallery with nowhere to go but forward or back into the sea. Many chose to go forward, if only because standing still meant death with certainty. Others stayed where they were, pressing themselves into the volcanic sand as if they could somehow sink through it and disappear. The amphibious assault vehicles, the armored tracked craft that were supposed to provide cover and mobility, became nothing more than targets. A single mortar shell would erupt through the thin roof of an Amtrak, turning it into a coffin. The men inside, packed shoulder to shoulder with ammunition and supplies and fear, had nowhere to go. Some burned, some drowned in the surf as their vehicles sank. Some simply vanished, leaving no remains at all. The corpsmen moved among the chaos, and in those first hours, their courage became almost mechanical, a kind of reflex action that overrode every instinct towards self-preservation. A Navy corpsman, there were thousands of them attached to the Marine units, identified by the Red Cross on their helmet covers, would see a man go down and would move toward him in that crouching run that everyone on the beach was using, half sprint and half collapse. The corpsman would drop beside the wounded Marine and begin assessing the injury while bullets snapped past his head with that distinctive crack that meant they were very close indeed. He would apply a tourniquet or pack a wound with gauze or inject morphine if the pain was too great. all the while keeping as low as possible and trying to shield the wounded man's body with his own. Then he would move on, or drag the man back toward the aid station if the wound was serious enough, or simply stay with him if there was nothing more to be done. By the end of that first day, the Navy corpsmen, attached to the Marines on Iwo Jima, had lost nearly 10% of their own number. They would continue to die throughout the battle. Men like John Bradley, who would survive to become one of the flag raisers, and so many others who would not. By the middle of the morning, the American command structure was in chaos, though this chaos was largely invisible to the men on the beach. The unit commanders could not communicate with their higher headquarters because the radio nets were clogged with casualty reports and requests for support and urgent pleas for anything that might ease the killing on the sand. Officers found themselves operating with no clear picture of the overall situation, knowing only what they could see from their immediate vicinity, and what they could see was mostly dead and dying Marines. Men were separated from their units in the confusion of the landing and the smoke. Squad leaders improvised, gathering whoever was nearby and pushing inland, even if they were not sure they were going in the right direction. Some of these improvised groups became the spearhead of the American advance, not because of any grand plan, but simply because the men in them were willing to move forward rather than wait for orders that might never come. The volcanic sand became an enemy almost as deadly as the Japanese. It was fine enough that it clogged weapons and reduced the effective range of grenades and made it nearly impossible to dig proper foxholes. Your shovel would hit the looser sand and it would simply slide back into the hole behind you. Men would attempt to construct some kind of shelter, some slight rise or depression that might protect them from fire, and the sand would betray them, accepting their bodies, but offering nothing in return. The vehicles that made it off the beach found the sand nearly impassable. Tank commanders, who had expected to be able to maneuver and support the infantry, found themselves stuck on the beach or moving at walking speed, completely exposed to artillery fire. Some tanks were abandoned when they became bogged down. Others were destroyed by mines and anti-tank guns positioned in the rising terrain. The Marines quickly learned that armor would be of limited value on Iwo Jima, which meant that they would have to do most of the fighting on foot, with rifles and grenades and flamethrowers, against an enemy that had months to prepare the ground. By late afternoon of the first day, perhaps 2,000 Marines had died or been wounded on the beaches and in the first few hundred meters inland. The beachhead was still less than 2 kilometers wide in most places, and barely 500 meters deep in others. At no point did the American commanders seriously consider pulling back and trying again another day. The decision had been made before the landing that Iwo Jima would be taken, and even if the price was higher than anyone had anticipated, the only option was to keep feeding men into the furnace. The supply situation was desperate. The beaches were so congested with bodies and vehicles and abandoned equipment that bringing in additional supplies or reinforcements was becoming nearly impossible. Officers were estimating they would need several more days just to establish a secure beachhead. They had no idea that they would be fighting for another month. The terrain itself began to reveal itself as darkness fell on that first day. The island was not flat or gently sloping, as the aerial reconnaissance photographs might have suggested. Instead, it was a series of broken, rocky ridges, separated by ravines and broken ground. Mount Suribachi rose in the south, like a monument to the fighting that was still to come. To the north, the ground rose in a series of plateaus, each one fortified and prepared for defense. The American Marines who began the grinding process of pushing inland in those first evening hours were moving through what amounted to a natural fortress, every advantage held by the defenders. Japanese soldiers, living in tunnels and caves beneath the surface, could appear and disappear at will. A Marine unit might clear a section of ground only to find Japanese soldiers emerging from a bunker that had been 50 meters behind them the entire time. The concept of a front line, which had some meaning in the Pacific before this, became almost meaningless on Iwo Jima. The fighting was three-dimensional, with the enemy as likely to be above you as in front of you or beside you. Yet somehow, in those first hours and the first full day, small units of Marines began to achieve tactical success simply by refusing to stop moving forward. A squad leader named Joe Rosenthal, or perhaps it was someone else, for the battle was too confused for the names of all the heroes to be properly recorded, would organize the men around him and say something like, "Well, we came to take this island, and the only way out is to keep going." The men would fix bayonets and advance against positions that seemed impregnable, and often enough, the Japanese defenders, expecting a larger assault or thrown off by the American tactics, would pull back or be killed in the close fighting that ensued. The American Marine training, emphasizing leadership at the squad and platoon level, meant that when the higher command structure broke down, the units could still function, still make decisions, still push forward. This resilience would characterize the entire battle. By the end of the first day, the American casualty count stood at more than 2,000 men. The Japanese, by contrast, had lost relatively few, perhaps a few hundred, mostly those who had died in the direct area of the beachhead and the southern end of the island. The disparity was not unusual in the Pacific War. Japanese defensive doctrine emphasized maximizing enemy casualties while preserving Japanese forces for the decisive point. Kuribayashi had planned for exactly this kind of grinding, attrition-based battle. He had told his men that every meter of ground that the Americans gained would cost them blood, and in those first hours, the plan was working with terrible efficiency. Yet even as the Japanese counted their successes in casualties inflicted, the Americans were managing to establish themselves on the island. The beachhead, though small and fragile, was holding. Ships continued to pour supplies and reinforcements ashore. The Americans, it seemed, were willing to accept the casualties required to take the island, which meant that all the pain Kuribayashi was inflicting might delay the inevitable, but could not prevent it. The medical teams working in the aid stations on the beach were overwhelmed from the first moments. A Navy doctor working in a dugout that had been hastily prepared on the sand would have wounded men stacked outside waiting for treatment, some of them already dead, others dying while waiting, others destined to lose limbs or sight or the ability to walk. The decisions were brutal and necessary. Which men would be treated first? Which men would be sent back to the hospital ships? Which men would be left behind because their wounds were too severe and the resources too limited? The system worked, in its way, because the medical personnel were willing to work under fire and without sleep, and with the constant knowledge that men were dying that they might have been able to save if only there had been more time, or more supplies, or more hands. By the end of the first day, hundreds of wounded Marines had been evacuated to the hospital ships standing offshore, where surgeons were preparing for a flood that would continue for weeks. As darkness fell on the 19th of February, the Marine units on Iwo Jima were digging in, preparing for a counterattack that everyone expected would come during the night. The Japanese garrison had been trained to conduct banzai charges, mass assaults intended to break the American lines. But Kuribayashi, that careful student of American firepower, had forbidden such attacks. His men would hold their positions and let the Americans come to them. Still, some Japanese units did attempt aggressive action during the first night, probing the American lines and launching small attacks designed to disrupt and demoralize. The Marines, exhausted and traumatized by the day's slaughter, fought back with the desperation of men who understood that one mistake might cost them their lives. The night on Iwo Jima was cold and terrifying in equal measure. Men stayed awake, watching the darkness, listening for sounds that might indicate Japanese movement. Flares would light up the beach periodically, turning night briefly into a harsh, shadowless day, then plunging everything back into darkness. By morning, the American beachhead was still intact, though it had cost more blood to hold it than anyone had anticipated. The first full day of fighting on Iwo Jima had consumed the Americans' casualties at a rate that no one in the command structure had truly prepared for. Yet the psychological impact on the men themselves was perhaps even more significant than the numbers they had seen. In a single day, the true cost of fighting an enemy that would not surrender, that could not be intimidated, that had prepared every inch of ground to maximize American casualties. They had learned that their training and their courage and their equipment, while necessary, were not sufficient to make this battle easy. They had begun the grinding process of learning to fight on Iwo Jima, learning that every ridgeline must be taken by assault, every bunker must be destroyed methodically, every gain in ground must be paid for in the currency of blood. Ahead of them lay Mount Suribachi and the mysterious mountain itself, and beyond that, the real fortress, the prepared positions in the north, where Kuribayashi's strength lay waiting. But for now, on that first night on the black sand beaches, the Marines could only consolidate what they had gained and prepare for another day of killing and dying on the island that smelled like sulfur and volcanic rock and death. The volcanic cone rose sharply at the southern tip of the island, a ragged tooth of black rock thrust upward, perhaps 550 feet above the black sand beaches. Mount Suribachi was its name. The Japanese called it that, though to the men who stared up at its slopes through the smoke and dust of that first day, it looked less like a named geographical feature and more like a natural fortress that had been waiting millions of years for this particular war to arrive. From the beach, it seemed to squat over everything, commanding the southern reaches of Iwo Jima with a brooding permanence that no amount of naval gunfire or aviation bombardment could diminish. The mountain slopes were steep, loose with volcanic ash, and riddled with caves and gun positions that had been prepared with meticulous care over the preceding months. Japanese engineers had honeycombed the mountain's interior and exterior with bunkers, pillboxes, and tunnel entrances. Artillery observers positioned near its summit could see the entire southern beach and could direct fire with precision across the landing zones, where American Marines were still consolidating their footholds and bringing equipment ashore. For General Holland Smith and his commanders, Suribachi was not simply a tactical problem to solve. It was a symbol that had to be removed from the landscape, a physical reminder of Japanese defiance that blocked the American advance and dominated the psychological space of the battle's first phase. The assault on Suribachi began almost immediately after the initial landings, even as Marines were still struggling to move inland from the beaches against intense resistance. The 4th Marine Division, under the command of Major General Clifton Cates, received orders to swing south and then west, moving to encircle the mountain from the inland side, while other units pressed up its slopes from the beach. This was not a simple frontal assault, but rather a carefully conceived envelopment designed to trap the Japanese garrison on the mountain and cut it off from reinforcement from the north, where the bulk of Kuribayashi's main defensive line was being prepared. The Japanese commander had concentrated his main strength in the fortifications across the central plateau and northern sector of the island, understanding that Suribachi, while important, could be bypassed and reduced once the primary defensive positions were overrun. Nevertheless, the mountain held significant numbers of troops. Estimates would later suggest somewhere between 300 and 500 Japanese soldiers entrenched across its surface and in its interior, and they had orders to hold the position as long as possible, to make the Americans pay for every foot of volcanic slope. The Marines attempting to encircle and assault the mountain-faced terrain that was merciless, slopes of loose ash and rock that offered no natural cover and frequent afforded no purchase for rapid movement. Men slid backward, even as they pushed forward, their boots sinking into the volcanic sand, their ammunition heavy, and their bodies already exhausted from the chaos of the landing beaches. The fighting on Suribachi's slopes began on the 19th of February and continued for 4 days of grinding, close-quarters combat that would push the 4th Marine Division to its limits. The mountain's defenses were built in layers, each position designed to support those around it, creating killing zones that were difficult to assault directly. Japanese machine guns positioned in caves halfway up the slopes could rake the lower slopes where Marines tried to establish assault positions. Mortar fire, directed by spotters on the higher elevations, fell with accuracy on the lower approaches. As Marines moved upward, they faced defenders emerging from tunnel entrances, throwing grenades down the slopes, and fighting with rifles and grenades from positions that seemed to multiply the higher one climbed. The volcanic rock itself became a weapon, jagged, unforgiving. It cut hands and knees and offered minimal cover. Marines learned quickly that conventional infantry tactics, the rush and bound, the use of fire and maneuver, had to be adapted to the vertical terrain and the determined Japanese defense. Small unit leaders found themselves having to be extraordinarily aggressive and creative, pressing attacks upward even when ammunition was low and casualties were mounting, understanding that any halt in momentum would simply give the defenders more time to reorganize and resist. Flamethrower teams became essential to the assault on Suribachi in ways that had not been entirely anticipated in the pre-battle planning. As Marines encountered cave entrances and bunker positions, the standard approach of grenades and rifle fire often proved insufficient to force Japanese defenders to abandon their positions. Flamethrower teams, working in coordination with riflemen and demolition squads, began systematically moving up the slopes, using the distinctive napalm-based weapon to ignite cave entrances and drive defenders out into the open or destroy them where they sheltered. The psychological impact of the flamethrower, the roar of ignition, the wall of flame, the heat that scorched everything in its path, was profound, affecting both the defenders who faced it and the attackers who wielded it. Marines operating the flamethrowers carried tremendous weight in the form of fuel tanks, operating hoses, and ammunition for the weapon, and they moved at the point of each assault, desperately vulnerable to snipers and defenders who specifically targeted them. The loss rate among flamethrower operators was extraordinary, yet men continued to step forward to take the weapon and use it, knowing the risks. In the darkness of caves and bunker positions, in the confined spaces where conventional gunfire was useless, the flamethrower became the tool that broke resistance and enabled forward progress. Behind the flamethrower teams came demolition squads, sappers carrying bags of explosives, blocks of TNT, Bangalore torpedoes, and improvised explosive charges designed to collapse cave entrances permanently, to seal shut the fortifications that had been prepared with such labor-intensive care. The encirclement progressed gradually through the 20th and 21st of February, as Marine units moved along the eastern and western sides of the mountain, slowly tightening a noose around the Japanese defenders, while other units pressed upward from the southern base. The terrain made any kind of coordinated large-scale attack nearly impossible. The battle resolved itself into countless small engagements involving squads and platoons, sometimes only handfuls of men, fighting in isolation from each other. Communications became unreliable as units moved higher up the slopes and became separated by rock outcroppings and the mountain's natural features. Officers had to rely on runners to move between positions, and sometimes on improvised signal systems using colored smoke or hand signals. The Japanese defenders, understanding that they were being encircled and that the reinforcement from the north would not come, began to consolidate their strength into more defensible interior positions, retreating from surface bunkers and moving into the tunnels, where they could continue resistance even as the Americans moved across the higher elevations. Some Japanese soldiers, understanding the hopelessness of their position, but following orders that emphasized fighting to the death rather than surrender, prepared themselves for what they believed would be their final stand. The mountain became a warren of small battlefields, each one a story of particular men facing particular dangers, each contributing tiny increments of progress toward the summit. By the 22nd of February, the encirclement was tightening to a degree that organized Japanese resistance on the mountain was becoming increasingly fragmented. The Americans had moved up to positions approximately 300 yards below the summit, and continued assaults were pushing toward the very top. The remaining Japanese defenders were compressed into an ever smaller zone of operations, concentrated in the upper caves and bunker positions that overlooked the final assault slope. Some Japanese soldiers launched counterattacks against the American positions, coming up from the tunnels in sudden rushes, attempting to break through the encirclement, or to at least kill as many Marines as possible before they themselves were killed. These counterattacks were typically repulsed, but they came at cost and required reserves to be committed to hold the lines that had been established. Artillery fire continued to rain down from American positions on the lower part of the island, and Marine engineers moved forward to position demolition charges at cave entrances on the lower and middle slopes, systematically closing off the Japanese defensive network section by section. The mountain's interior was becoming a tomb, with tunnel entrances either destroyed or manned by only a few defenders willing to die in place rather than surrender. By the morning of the 23rd of February, American units were positioned across the upper reaches of Suribachi, and the assault on the summit itself was in its final stages. The fall of Suribachi was not a single dramatic moment of conquest, but rather the culmination of 4 days of grinding combat that had cost the 4th Marine Division hundreds of casualties and had claimed the lives of nearly all of the Japanese defenders who had begun the assault. As American Marines reached the summit in the early hours of the 23rd, they found the top of the mountain largely cleared of defenders and heavily cratered from bombardment and explosions. Japanese bodies lay among the bunker wreckage and cave ruins. The defenders who had not been killed in place had either retreated into the deepest tunnel sections of the mountain or had died in the final assaults on the upper slopes. For the Marines who reached the summit, there was a moment of stillness before the realization that one significant phase of the battle had been completed. The encirclement had been successful. Suribachi was no longer a source of fire control over the southern beaches, no longer a symbol of Japanese dominance over the northern portions of the island. The 4th Marine Division had paid for this achievement, with casualties that would take them out of the line for reorganization and rest. The mountain's conquest, however, represented only the first phase of the greater battle that was unfolding across the island to the north, where the real Japanese defensive master plan had been positioned, and where the heaviest concentrations of troops, artillery, and fortification remained largely untouched by the 4 days of fighting that had raged on Suribachi's slopes. What the conquest of Suribachi meant strategically and what it meant psychologically were two different calculations that would begin to diverge almost immediately. Tactically, the fall of the mountain was significant because it removed a source of coordinated fire that had plagued the landing operations, and because it completed the encirclement of the southern portion of the island, allowing American forces to now turn their full attention to the grinding advance toward the north. The mountain's summit could be used as an observation post for spotting fire across the island's northern reaches. Supply lines to the northern sector could now be established without the constant threat of fire from the south. The psychological significance of Suribachi's fall was, however, far more complicated, and it would shape the way the entire battle was understood, not just by the men fighting it, but by the public and press who followed the battle through dispatches and photographs. A volcano conquered, a flag planted at its summit, an ancient symbol of Japanese power cast down. These images and metaphors would dominate the home front narrative of the Iwo Jima campaign, creating a dangerous impression that the hard fighting was over, that the worst had passed, and that the Americans had essentially won the battle. In reality, 3/4 of the island remained in Japanese hands. The most elaborate defensive fortifications had not yet been engaged, and the fighting ahead would be longer, more bitter, and ultimately more costly than the 4 days that had been required to take Suribachi. By the morning of the 23rd of February 1945, Mount Suribachi had been encircled. The 4-day assault up its slopes had cost the lives of hundreds of Japanese defenders and American Marines alike. But the physics of the siege had finally turned. Japanese units that had held the mountain's interior caves and terraced positions had been steadily compressed, their avenues of retreat cut off by American infantry advancing from the east and south. The remaining defenders had either died in their positions or were preparing for the final moments of a battle they could no longer win. The air above the mountain was thick with smoke from artillery fire and the burning of bunkers sealed with flame and explosive. In the tunnels beneath the summit, what remained of the Japanese garrison knew the end was hours away. By late afternoon on the 22nd, organized resistance had been reduced to scattered pockets, and senior Japanese officers had made the decision to abandon the mountain's peak. By dawn on the 23rd, the summit lay exposed to American hands. A patrol from Easy Company of the 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, roughly 40 men under the command of 2nd Lieutenant Harold Schreier, was tasked with reaching the summit and establishing a perimeter. These were not the first Americans to stand at the top of Suribachi. Other patrols had made brief appearances on the crater rim in the preceding days, always under fire, always under the necessity of withdrawing. But on the morning of the 23rd, as Schreier's men climbed through the ash and pumice toward the peak, moving past the blackened mouths of cave entrances and the scattered remains of the fierce fighting of previous days, sporadic fire from isolated positions was no longer directed at them. The patrol reached the summit without catastrophic casualties. They secured the crater rim and established a small defensive perimeter. Schreier radioed down to his commanding officer, Major John Severance, with a simple message. The peak was secure. The question now was what to do with the pole and flag that Schreier's men had brought up the mountain with them. The flag Schreier's patrol carried was small, roughly 4 feet by 2 feet in size. It had been taken from a Navy landing ship tank that morning, a standard-issue flag meant for identification purposes. Schreier ordered it raised on a metal pipe that his men lashed to a rocky outcrop near the summit's highest point. The men who helped raise that first flag were performing a practical task, not a ceremonial one. They were claiming the summit for the United States, signaling to the rest of the island that the strong point had been taken. Below on the island and across the fleet, that small flag appeared as a speck of color against the ash and smoke. Men who had been fighting for 4 days saw it and understood what it meant. The Japanese still occupied 3/4 of the island, but the symbolic heart of the mountain had been taken. Word of the flag raising spread through the American lines with remarkable speed. Cheers were heard across the beachhead, and an almost audible shift in morale rippled through thousands of exhausted men. By midday, however, some senior commanders on the island made a decision. The small flag was effective as a signal to the troops immediately around Suribachi, but its symbolic power was being lost in the distance and the smoke. A decision was made to replace it with a larger flag, this one 5 feet by 8 feet, that would be visible across the entire island and potentially across the fleet. The larger flag was obtained from the USS Arlington, a cargo ship anchored offshore. A replacement detail was organized. This time, the men chosen to make the climb were not solely from Easy Company. They were drawn from various units and included Navy hospital corpsmen and combat engineers, alongside the Marines, who had carried the first flag to the top. Among them were Private First Class Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian Marine from Arizona, Private First Class Franklin Sousley, Private Harold Keller, Sergeant Henry Hansen, Corporal Harlan Block, and Private Maurice Stroud. The exact composition of the group would become a matter of some dispute and historical confusion, but these men understood they were participating in something more than a simple task change. The second flag raising took place in the early afternoon of the 23rd of February. By this time, war correspondents and photographers had been moving across the beachhead, documenting the American advance. One of these photographers was Joe Rosenthal, working for the Associated Press. Rosenthal was an experienced combat photographer who had seen action in the Pacific before and understood the nature of the images the press was seeking. On the morning of the 23rd, Rosenthal had been on Iwo Jima for 4 days, photographing the chaos of the landings and the grinding assault across the beaches and up Suribachi's slopes. He was moving toward the summit with other correspondents and photographers when word spread that the flag raising was about to take place. He climbed toward the peak, camera in hand, aware that if the moment was worth capturing, he needed to be positioned to capture it. What happened next occurred in seconds, though it would be remembered and reproduced for decades to come. 6 men gathered around the pole that had been prepared to receive the larger flag. The ground beneath them was volcanic ash and loose rock. Behind them, the crater of Suribachi fell away. Below them, the rest of the island stretched out in a haze of smoke and dust. Above them, the sky was overcast, but bright enough for a photograph. The men began to raise the flag. They were not trained in ceremonial flag raising. They were combat soldiers and Marines performing a practical task at the end of a brutal assault. Yet the image they created, the strain of their bodies, the angle of their backs, the movement of the flagpole as it rose against the sky, captured something that transcended the moment. Rosenthal had positioned himself at ground level, looking upward. As the flag rose, he fired his camera. The photograph that emerged from that single moment froze an instant of American effort and determination, at the very moment when the battle's outcome was no longer in doubt. The photograph showed 6 men, bodies straining, muscles engaged, focused entirely on the physical act of raising the flag. Some were identified and named, others were misidentified. Ira Hayes would be recognized. So too, eventually, would Franklin Sousley and Harold Keller. But the photographic moment created an image that moved beyond the individuals in it. It became the visual definition of collective sacrifice, of teamwork, of American will imposing itself on an enemy strongpoint. The flag itself, that 5 by 8 foot piece of cloth, was almost secondary to the human effort required to raise it. Within hours, copies of Rosenthal's photograph had been transmitted to the United States via naval radio. By the evening of the 23rd of February, the image had been received by wire service offices. Within days, it was published in newspapers across America. The American public, which had received months of casualty lists and battle reports, suddenly had a visual representation of what their sons and brothers were achieving in the Pacific. The photograph was reproduced in magazines, on posters, in press releases. It became a symbol of the war itself. The reaction across the fleet was immediate and visceral. Men who could see Mount Suribachi in the distance noted the larger flag rising against the ash and smoke. A great cheer rose from the ships anchored offshore. Officers watching from the beach headquarters reported the moment as a turning point in morale, though the hardest fighting remained ahead. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, who had come ashore on the 23rd to observe the battle's progress, stood on the beach near the command post when he heard the news and witnessed the flag's appearance on Suribachi's summit. Forrestal, whose department would receive enormous credit for the visual documentation of the war, reportedly made a remark in the moment, a comment about the significance of the image and what it meant for the American home front. Different accounts record his exact words differently, but the substance was clear. He understood that the photograph would become important to the war effort and to American public consciousness. The moment of the flag raising was no longer simply a military event. It had become a symbol, a message being sent from the island to the American people. What none of those men understood in that moment, what could not have been known as the flag fluttered in the Pacific wind above Suribachi's peak, was the photograph's trajectory into history. Joe Rosenthal returned to the command post with his film. He processed it the same day. The image was transmitted, and within 24 hours, it had reached the Associated Press office in New York. It was published in newspapers on the 25th of February, 1945. But its life did not end there. It was not simply a war photograph, though it was that. It became one of the most reproduced images in the history of photography itself. It won the Pulitzer Prize for Photography in 1945. It was used as the model for the Marine Corps War Memorial in Washington, dedicated in 1954, where it stands cast in bronze on a pedestal overlooking the Potomac River. The image transcended its moment of creation. It became divorced from the specific battle and the specific men in it. It became instead an almost abstract representation of American sacrifice and collective effort. This separation between the image and its origins created confusion and controversy that would persist for decades. Two of the men in the photograph, Harlan Bloch and Henry Hansen, were killed in the weeks following the flag raising as the battle continued northward. Franklin Sousley was also killed on Iwo Jima in March. Private Maurice Stroud survived, but was not among those eventually selected to represent the flag raisers in the Bond Drive tours. Harold Keller survived. Ira Hayes survived. The names and faces of the 6 men became entangled in a web of misidentifications, corrections, and reinterpretations. Some confusion was inevitable. The photograph had been taken in seconds, and the men in it were not posed or named at the moment of capture. But the confusion also reflected something deeper. The photograph had become more important than the men who made it. The image had gained a significance that outweighed the individuals who created it. The symbol had superseded the reality. Yet, on the 23rd of February 1945, in the moment of the flag raising itself, such complications lay in the future. Men who had been locked in combat for 4 days, who had seen friends and comrades killed in the assault on Suribachi's slopes, witnessed the larger flag rise against the grey sky and understood what it meant. For those few minutes, As the flag caught the wind and fluttered above the mountain, the battle felt won. The island, they knew, was not yet secured. Fighting would continue for weeks, but the toughest strongpoint, the dominant terrain feature, had been taken. The Japanese garrison that had poured fire onto the beaches for 4 days had been pushed to the margins. The flow of the battle had turned irrevocably toward an American victory. Photographers captured that flag-raising moment, but thousands of Marines were witnesses to it as well. The memory of that image, whether the actual photograph or the scene witnessed in person, became embedded in their experience of the island. The flag on Mount Suribachi became shorthand for survival and success, the visual proof that the sacrifice of the previous days had purchased ground. The photograph Joe Rosenthal captured would endure as a statement of American collective effort and sacrifice far beyond the battle itself. But in the immediate aftermath of the flag raising, the photograph was simply documentation of an event that mattered to the men on Iwo Jima. It was evidence that they had accomplished something significant, that their sacrifice had achieved a tangible objective. Within days, the public back home would see the same photograph and understand, or believe they understood, what was happening on that distant island. The photograph became the bridge between the battle and the American consciousness. It told a story without words. It showed effort, determination, and the collective power of 6 men united in a common task. That such a simple image could carry such weight, could be reproduced countless times, and still retain its power, speaks to something fundamental in how Americans understood their role in the Second World War. The flag on Suribachi's summit was real. The photograph was real, but the myth that grew from that combination of image and symbol would prove far more durable than either the flag or the mountain itself. The photograph traveled faster than the men who took it. By the time Joe Rosenthal's image of 6 Marines raising the American flag on the summit of Mount Suribachi reached the newspapers on the mainland, a narrative had already begun to crystallize in the minds of the American public. The photograph itself was magnificent, a study in struggle and triumph, bodies straining upward against the weight of the pole, the flag spreading against a Pacific sky. But the moment that image appeared in print across the United States, something dangerous happened. People began to believe that the battle was over. The flag was raised. Victory was assured. Iwo Jima had fallen. Across living rooms and diners and factory break rooms, Americans who had watched the war with anxiety for nearly 4 years allowed themselves a rare moment of simple joy. The island was taken. The boys would be coming home soon. This was the false dawn. The misconception did not originate entirely in civilian imagination. Military leadership, or at least portions of it, had also begun to believe that the heaviest fighting might be behind them. After Suribachi fell on the 23rd of February, after the flag was raised and the word spread through the fleet and up the chain of command, there was a genuine sense that a major obstacle had been overcome. Some commanders allowed themselves cautious optimism. The press, present on the island and eager for a story that spoke of American success after months of grinding Pacific campaigns, seized on Suribachi's fall as the climactic moment of the invasion. Photographs and dispatches described the flag raising with language of culmination. Reporters quoted officers suggesting that organized resistance was collapsing. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, who had come ashore to observe the landing, stood on the beach below Suribachi and watched the flag flutter in the Pacific wind. He would later remark that the raising of that flag on Suribachi meant the Marines had won the battle. Such statements, made by men of authority in the presence of journalists, hardened into the public understanding that the fight was essentially finished. But the geography of Iwo Jima told a different story entirely. Mount Suribachi, for all its symbolic weight, represented only the southern terminus of the island. It was an isolated volcanic cone, connected to the rest of the 8-square-mile island by a narrow neck of terrain that had already been severed from Japanese control the moment the Marines encircled it. When Suribachi fell, the Marines had secured something of profound psychological importance, but only a tiny fraction of the ground they still needed to hold. In fact, approximately 75% of the island, the central plateau, the broken volcanic ridges of the north, the numerous smaller fortified positions that Kuribayashi had spent months constructing, remained entirely in Japanese hands. The strongest fortifications had not yet been touched. The deepest bunkers still harbored undisturbed garrisons. The tunnel networks that honeycombed the island's interior had barely been probed. From a strictly military standpoint, the capture of Suribachi was an achievement, but it was not the achievement. It was a beginning, not an ending. The intelligence officers in the fleet and on the division staffs understood this distinction. They possessed reports from engineers who had studied the island through aerial reconnaissance and from interrogations of prisoners taken on Saipan and Guam, who knew something of the Japanese preparations. The briefings that preceded the landing had warned that Iwo Jima was heavily fortified and that resistance would be fierce and prolonged. The commanders expected casualties in the thousands. Holland Smith, the crusty Marine general commanding the 5th Amphibious Corps, was under no illusions. He had fought enough of these island battles to recognize the pattern. Initial landings under fire, gradual inland progress against hardening resistance, a middle phase of grinding attrition, and only then, after weeks, not days, the final collapse of organized enemy defense. Smith and his staff knew that the real battle lay ahead, but the public did not know this. The newspapers did not frame it this way. The soldiers still in the staging areas, who would soon be loaded onto transports and sent to join the fight, did not fully grasp it. The folk back home certainly did not understand. This gap between reality and perception created a dangerous psychological phenomenon. Men ashore on Iwo Jima after the 23rd of February were operating in an environment where everyone above them seemed to believe the worst was over, yet the evidence of their own senses contradicted that belief completely. Young Marines, many of them 18 or 19 years old, moving north from Suribachi into the interior of the island, encountered Japanese fire almost immediately. The terrain they began to navigate was far more daunting than the beaches had been. Black volcanic ridges thrust upward without vegetation or cover. The ground was scored with ravines and crevasses. Bunkers appeared not as singular positions but in clusters, each fortification supporting the others, each designed so that approaching Marines would come under fire from multiple angles simultaneously. The volume of fire suggested not a collapsing garrison, but one that was preparing to make its stand. Yet in the rear areas, in the division headquarters and corps headquarters, the optimistic narrative persisted. Reports from the front were filtered through the understanding that victory was in hand. This created a subtle but corrosive pressure on commanders in the field to advance faster than the tactical situation warranted, to take greater risks, to accept higher casualties in pursuit of a victory that was supposedly imminent, but in fact remained weeks distant. The term that Marines would eventually use to describe the terrain they now faced was the meat grinder. The name captured something essential about what lay ahead, the systematic, methodical nature of the killing ground that Kuribayashi had designed. It was not the desperate last stand of a defeated enemy. It was the prepared killing ground of an enemy who had spent months positioning artillery, constructing interlocking fields of fire, and calculating exactly where American forces would be forced to concentrate to advance northward. The meat grinder was not a single location, but a philosophy of defense embodied across multiple terrain features. Hill 342, the amphitheater, Turkey Knob, and dozens of smaller positions, all integrated into a defensive network so sophisticated that destroying one position often resulted in fire from 3 others. Kuribayashi had learned from the failures of other Japanese commanders. He did not believe in frontal counterattacks or banzai charges. He believed in making the Americans pay a price in blood for every meter of ground. He believed in attrition. He believed in the mathematics of suffering. And everything that was about to occur on the plateau north of Suribachi would prove him correct in that calculation. The moment the Marines turned north from the slopes of Suribachi and began to move into the plateau region, they entered a different kind of battle entirely. The enemy here was not concentrated in beach fortifications that naval gunfire could target from offshore. The enemy was distributed, deeply buried, and mutually supporting. The terrain offered no clear front line, no obvious sequence of tactical objectives. Instead, there were simply hills and ridges that had to be cleared one by one, each one potentially harboring bunkers, each one capable of delivering fire across a zone where the next position would be located. American artillery, which had proven invaluable in other island campaigns, was less effective here because the targets were hidden and dispersed. Close air support, which had helped elsewhere, could not eliminate an enemy that lived in tunnels 60 and 70 feet underground. The battle shifted from maneuver to siege, from speed to grinding attrition. And as it shifted, the contradiction between what the home front believed and what the men on the island were experiencing became ever more acute. The letters and accounts that Marines wrote home during this phase reveal the dissonance clearly. Men who had not expected to still be fighting on Iwo Jima in early March, who had heard rumors that the island was taken and that rotation home might come soon, found themselves instead engaged in the bloodiest combat of their lives. Platoons that had suffered 50% casualties in the first week of fighting would suffer another 50% in the second week. Companies would be reduced to squads. Squads would be reduced to handfuls of men, commanded by the most senior person remaining, often a lance corporal. The casualty rates began to exceed anything the medical personnel had anticipated. The hospital ships anchored offshore began to fill beyond capacity. The division surgeons, working in conditions of controlled chaos, made impossible decisions about which wounded men would be transported and which would have to wait, perhaps to die while waiting. The corpsmen, the Navy medical personnel attached to Marine units, began to display a level of heroism that bordered on the suicidal. These men, many of them trained for medicine rather than combat, found themselves repeatedly running across fire-swept ground to reach wounded Marines, knowing with near certainty that they themselves would be shot at, knowing that their chances of surviving the day were slim. Yet back home, the newspapers were still running stories about victory. The flag-raising photograph continued to circulate. Plans were being made to bring home 3 of the 6 men photographed to tour the country for war bond drives. The public relations machinery was already at work, converting the image into propaganda for the bond drives and for the war effort generally. There was no sense in the American public consciousness that the real battle was just beginning, that the worst was still ahead, that the casualty lists were about to grow exponentially. The servicemen back in staging areas, who would be shipping out to Iwo Jima in the coming weeks, had no idea what they were about to face. The High Command, in its public statements, maintained the narrative of imminent victory, but the men on the island knew better. The men counting bodies at the aid stations knew better. The men whose units had been halved in a week of fighting knew better. The divergence between the public story and the actual experience became a kind of psychological weight that added to the physical exhaustion and fear that came with the fighting. The danger of the false dawn was not merely that it misled the American public about the progress of the battle. The danger was that it created a framework of expectation that made the subsequent weeks of brutal fighting seem somehow like a failure or an unnecessary extension. If victory had been achieved with the raising of the flag on Suribachi, then why were Marines still dying? Why were reinforcements still being poured onto the island? Why was the casualty count continuing to climb? The false dawn created the conditions for disillusionment and frustration, not only among the troops, but among the public as well. It also, perhaps, created a subtle pressure on commanders to achieve a faster resolution than the actual military situation allowed. If the flag raising meant victory, then the continuing battle must mean something was going wrong. If something was going wrong, then the solution was to push harder, advance faster, take greater risks. The false dawn, in other words, may have contributed to the intensity of the fighting in March, may have driven the Marines forward into the meat grinder with less caution than the terrain and the enemy resistance warranted. The real battle for Iwo Jima was not won on the 23rd of February, when the flag reached the summit of Mount Suribachi. The real battle was only just beginning. The terrain north of Suribachi was a maze of ridges and volcanic rock, dug and fortified by thousands of Japanese soldiers, with nothing to lose and everything to prove. The American forces had landed on the island, intending to take it in 10 days. They had encountered pre-invasion bombardment that lasted only 3 days instead of 10, which had left the underground fortifications largely intact. They had then captured the most obvious geographical feature on the island, the one that happened to be completely isolated from the main Japanese defensive positions. And now they had to fight their way through the real fortress, the one Kuribayashi had designed, the one he had spent months building, the one that represented his masterpiece of defensive architecture and operational planning. The flag on Suribachi meant something. It meant that Marines could climb a mountain in combat. It meant that American troops could achieve a visible, symbolic victory. But it did not mean that Iwo Jima had been taken. It did not mean that organized resistance was collapsing. It certainly did not mean the battle was over. The weeks ahead would prove how deceptive that dawn had been. The plateau was about to become a killing ground like nothing the American forces had yet experienced in the Pacific War. Battalions would lose more than half their strength in single days of fighting. Positions that seemed to have been cleared would suddenly burst into fire again as Japanese soldiers emerged from hidden bunkers. The tunnel network would prove to be a kind of parallel battlefield that existed beneath the surface, allowing enemy soldiers to appear behind American positions, to stage counterattacks from unexpected directions, to maintain command and control even as the surface defenses were systematically destroyed. The casualty count would climb inexorably upward. The hospital ships would remain anchored offshore, their decks crowded with wounded men, their medical teams working around the clock. And all of this would happen while newspapers back home continued to speak of victory won, of flags planted, of the boys coming home soon. The false dawn had ended. The real darkness of the meat grinder was about to begin. By the 23rd of February 1945, when the American flag was raised over Mount Suribachi's summit, the Marines, who now turned their faces northward toward the center of Iwo Jima, believed they had breached the island's main defenses. What lay ahead of them was not the broken remnant of a defeated garrison, but rather the true skeleton of Kuribayashi's defensive masterpiece. The volcano had been a prize, yes, but it was also a necessary distraction. The real fortress had been waiting in the high ground to the north, a maze of interconnected fortifications spread across the volcanic plateau that would become known among American troops by names that rang with bitter irony: Hill 342, the Amphitheater, and Turkey Knob. Marines would come to call this stretch of devastated terrain by another name, one that captured the mechanized horror of what they were about to endure. They called it the meat grinder. The name was not poetic, it was precise. The geography of this killing ground was almost calculated to favor the defender. The central plateau of Iwo Jima rose in tiers and ridges, creating a natural fortress that required no walls. Hill 342, which dominated the center of the island, stood roughly 180 feet above the surrounding terrain. Not towering, but high enough to command every approach. To its east lay the amphitheater, a saddle-shaped formation of broken ground ringed by ridges, where defenders could shoot down into the advancing Marines from nearly every direction. To the northeast, Turkey Knob rose as a cluster of fortifications built into fractured rock, its name derived from its vague resemblance to that shape when viewed from certain angles. Between these three positions, across a wasteland of pumice and broken stone, Japanese engineers had carved bunkers, observation posts, and interlocking fields of fire that had taken them months to construct and refine. This was not improvisation. This was Kuribayashi's doctrine, made concrete and steel. This was deliberate, methodical, and absolutely unforgiving. The Japanese had learned from the American approach to fortified positions. They understood now that a single bunker, no matter how strong, would eventually be destroyed. A Marine would crawl forward under fire, plant a charge, and the position would fall. But a series of bunkers arranged so that destroying one exposed the attacker to fire from three others. That was a different proposition entirely. The strength of Kuribayashi's northern fortress lay not in its individual positions, but in their relationship to one another. A bunker on Hill 342 covered the approaches to the amphitheater. An artillery cave in Turkey Knob could rake the open ground between the hills. Infantry firing from concealed positions in the ravines could pour fire into any unit attempting to move from one objective to the next. The Americans had no choice but to attack. They could not go around. There was nowhere to go around to. They could not wait. Time favored the defenders, who had water and ammunition deep underground, while the Marines on the surface grew more exhausted with each passing day. They could only advance, and advancing meant walking into a carefully constructed system of death. The assault on the meat grinder began in the last days of February and continued into March. Marine battalions that had landed with roughly 900 men each found themselves, after a few days of fighting in this terrain, reduced to 200 or 300 combat-effective troops. The rate of attrition was unlike anything the Pacific War had yet produced. A Marine might advance 50 meters in an entire day. He might advance against a bunker, destroy it, and then discover that what he thought was a position held by 5 men was actually connected underground to a position 50 meters away, where another squad of Japanese soldiers was waiting for him to expose himself. The fighting had a nightmarish quality to it, because the enemy seemed to exist on multiple levels simultaneously. A position might appear cleared, swept and searched by methodical young Marines, moving through the rubble, with fixed bayonets and grenades, and then, minutes later, rifle fire would erupt from behind the same position, from slots in the rock that had been carefully concealed. The confusion and the fury this created among the American troops cannot be understated. Marines were fighting not just against an enemy with superior defensive positions, but against an enemy whose defensive positions seemed to reproduce themselves endlessly across the landscape. The terrain itself became a weapon. The volcanic rock was sharp and unforgiving, slashing uniforms and skin. The pumice stone was sometimes so soft that men sank into it while under fire, unable to gain purchase, unable to move quickly. And there were crevasses, sudden drops into ravines where Japanese soldiers waited with machine guns and grenades. The cold of the nights was brutal, with temperatures dropping sharply once the sun fell, while the days were hot under the sulphurous haze that hung over the island. Marines suffered from dehydration, from exhaustion, from the constant alertness demanded by an enemy that refused to break contact. Units that had trained together for months, that had learned to move and fight as cohesive teams, began to fragment under the strain. Replacements arrived to fill the gaps left by the killed and wounded, but replacements were men who did not know the veterans, who had to learn their unit's rhythms under fire, and who often died before they could be integrated into the group. Artillery became the Marines' great equalizer, and the guns supporting the assault on the meat grinder fired with a constancy that was almost ritualistic. Before an attack, shells would fall for hours, laying down a barrage that was supposed to suppress Japanese fire and destroy fortifications. The Marines had learned that the shelling rarely destroyed the buried bunkers completely, but it kept the defenders' heads down, and it gave the attacking troops a brief window in which to advance. Yet the moment the shelling lifted, the Japanese would emerge from their shelters. If the Marines had gained only 20 or 30 meters during the assault, the Japanese defenders were still in position to shoot at them from flanking positions. This created a bizarre rhythm to the fighting: attack, advance, consolidate, prepare for counterattack, get shelled, attack again. The cycle repeated with mechanical regularity, each repetition grinding away at the Marine units engaged in the assault. Company commanders watched their companies dwindle. Platoon sergeants found themselves leading what had once been squads. Squad leaders were commanding a handful of men instead of a full team. The names of the individual actions fought across this plateau in the days of late February and early March became a grim litany in the histories and unit records. Hill 342 saw multiple assaults, each one preceded by artillery and airstrikes, each one meeting the same devastating response from Japanese defenders. The amphitheater seemed to expand the longer the Marines fought there, as if the broken ground itself was generating new defensive positions. Turkey Knob, with its complex of fortifications built into solid rock, resisted repeated assaults and required weeks of grinding combat before it was finally overrun. Between these major objectives lay dozens of smaller engagements: pillbox assaults, tank support calls when armor could be brought forward across the broken terrain, and desperate actions by small units trying to maintain the momentum of advance against an enemy that never seemed to run out of ammunition or soldiers willing to use it. The Japanese were also losing heavily. Their garrison was finite. Every man killed was a man who could not be replaced. But the speed of Japanese attrition, while measurable, seemed almost irrelevant to the Marines engaged in the fighting. What mattered was the next attack, the next objective, the next chance to advance and survive. The role of individual acts of extraordinary courage became amplified in these conditions. Marines earned decorations for actions that would have been considered routine in less savage terrain. A man who destroyed a bunker with hand grenades, a corpsman who crawled forward under fire to treat a wounded Marine, an officer who organized a defensive position while wounded. These actions were not unique in the Pacific War, but their frequency and the circumstances under which they occurred gave them a desperate quality. Men understood they might die. This was not a possibility that haunted them. It was a probability that they worked to overcome through discipline, training, and the bonds of unit cohesion. When those bonds held, Marines could accomplish extraordinary things. When they began to fray under the weight of casualties and fatigue, the situation became untenable. Unit commanders began requesting relief. They were told there were no fresh reserves to relieve them. They must continue the assault. And continue they did, though each day seemed to move more slowly than the last. The Japanese garrison, meanwhile, was experiencing its own version of this grinding process. The reinforcements and supply runs that Kuribayashi had hoped for never materialized. American naval and air superiority meant that no transport could reach the island. No new artillery shells arrived. No new soldiers. The garrison that had begun the battle with roughly 23,000 men, though exact figures remain debated by historians, was steadily being reduced by daily combat. Yet Kuribayashi's orders remained unchanged. Fight. Hold every position. Make the Americans pay in blood for every meter of ground. Do not surrender. Do not waste men in suicidal charges, but in defending positions. Use the terrain and the tunnels to inflict maximum casualties. The order was not to kill the maximum number of Americans, though that was a result. The order was to make the island so costly that American planners would recoil from invading the Japanese home islands themselves. This was Kuribayashi's strategic purpose, and it was being served by the grinding horror of the meat grinder, just as effectively as a dramatic breakthrough or a climactic final stand would have been. The casualty figures from this phase of the battle were staggering. By the 1st of March, the American forces had suffered more than 9,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. The 4th Marine Division, which had started the battle with roughly 16,000 men, was down to roughly 40% of its fighting strength. The 5th Marine Division was in slightly better condition, having been committed to the island later, and thus having suffered fewer days of continuous combat, but it too was badly worn. The 3rd Marine Division, held in reserve and only partially committed, represented the last mobile force available to American commanders. To keep the assault moving northward, men who should have been pulled out of the line for rest and reconstitution were instead given replacements and sent back into the fight. This was not ideal, but Iwo Jima offered no luxury of ideal circumstances. The objective had to be taken. The strategic logic that had brought the fleet to these shores, the need for the airfields, the need to support the air campaign against Japan, demanded that the island be secured. The price being paid was appalling, but the price of not taking the island was judged to be even higher. The landscape of the meat grinder bore the marks of this ferocious contest. The volcanic rock was pulverized by artillery into fine ash. The few stunted plants that had somehow survived on the island were obliterated. Bodies of Japanese and American soldiers lay in positions where they had fallen, some unrecovered for days because the fighting was too intense to permit burial details to reach them. The smell of cordite mixed with the sulphurous odor of the island itself. The sound was constant, the bark of small arms fire, the deeper thud of grenades, the roar of artillery and mortars, and under it all, the sound of voices calling out in the chaos, sometimes giving orders, sometimes crying out in pain or fear. This was not war as the movies portrayed it, with dramatic charges and clear lines of advance. This was war as a grinding, incremental process. The Americans advanced, and the Japanese fell back to the next prepared position, and then the cycle began again. Kilometer by kilometer, meter by meter, the Marine units pushed northward through the meat grinder, and behind them, the island was being transformed from something resembling a place into something resembling a nightmare, rendered in black rock and ash. By early March, it was becoming clear that the battle would not be resolved by a climactic breakthrough. Instead, it would be won or lost through attrition and the willingness of one side or the other to break first. The Americans had the advantage of reinforcements trickling in and replacements to fill the gaps, along with overwhelming air and artillery support. The Japanese had the advantage of defensive terrain and the psychological fortress of Kuribayashi's unbreakable orders. Neither side was prepared to retreat. Neither side had the option of quitting. And so, the meat grinder continued to turn, processing young men and converting them into casualties, transforming one of the Pacific War's most brutal battles into something that went beyond even the savage standards of island warfare in 1945. The objective remained clear. The island would fall. The Japanese would be defeated. The strategic purpose for the amphibious assault would be fulfilled. But the price being exacted in the central plateau of Iwo Jima was rewriting the calculus of American strategy and raising questions about what victory actually cost when the enemy was willing to fight to the absolute last man. The Marines had learned, by early March in 1945, that killing Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima was not like killing them anywhere else in the Pacific War. On other islands, you stormed a beach, fought through prepared positions, reached the far shore, and declared victory. The enemy was either dead or had run. But on Iwo Jima, the enemy lived inside the mountain itself. They lived in darkness, in passages that had been carved through volcanic rock over months of labor by thousands of hands. They lived in chambers, connected by tunnels that spiraled downward, sideways, and forward in directions that no American intelligence map could fully capture. And they had learned, through Lieutenant General Kuribayashi's meticulous planning, that their only path to victory was not to hold ground in the conventional sense, but to make the Americans pay in blood and time and exhaustion for every meter of that ground. The map, in other words, meant almost nothing when the real battle was happening in 3 dimensions, in the vertical space beneath the black sand. The tunnel system was not a single fortress. It was a vast, interconnected labyrinth that grew and evolved during the 3 months of its construction. The Japanese had driven their excavations through the volcanic geology with an understanding of how rock fractures and how heat moves through confined spaces. They knew that the sulfurous vents and volcanic activity would help ventilate the tunnels naturally, allowing men to breathe in chambers where no fresh air seemed possible. They had created redundancy in their passages, so that when one tunnel was sealed by demolition, 3 others remained open. They had positioned artillery pieces in specially carved caves, where the guns could fire, withdraw deeper into the rock, and fire again from a different location. Hospital chambers had been established in the deepest portions, where the rock itself provided natural insulation from the heat of the bombardment above. It was, in the estimation of American engineers who examined it after the battle, one of the most sophisticated underground fortification systems ever constructed by any nation during the Second World War. And no pre-invasion bombardment, no matter how intense or prolonged, could effectively destroy it, because most of it was already protected by more than 50 feet of solid volcanic rock. When a Marine unit cleared a trench line or captured a ridge, the men would establish a perimeter, post sentries, and believe, with reasonable certainty, that the ground behind them was secure. They would move forward to the next objective, and then, hours or days later, rifle fire would erupt from directly behind their position. A Japanese soldier would appear on a slope that had already been swept, his uniform intact, his rifle loaded, his intention clear. How had he gotten there? The answer was always the same: through the tunnels. The Japanese had not abandoned those positions. They had simply withdrawn underground, waited until the Marines had passed, and then emerged to harass the rear echelons, to snipe at supply lines, to create chaos in what the Americans believed was cleared territory. It was warfare that violated the fundamental logic that American Marines had come to expect. You did not take ground that you had to take again. You did not clear an area that uncleared itself days later. The tunnels made a mockery of the idea that holding territory meant you had actually conquered it. The psychological toll of this invisible enemy was immense and accumulated with every engagement. A man would lose comrades to what appeared to be a ghost, to an opponent who had seemingly ceased to exist. He would step around a corner and encounter a Japanese soldier who had emerged from a tunnel entrance that had been filled with sand and rubble an hour before. He would watch his platoon sergeant shot from behind by a figure who disappeared back into the earth before anyone could return fire. The Marines began to understand that the black sand itself was untrustworthy, that beneath their boots, beneath the landscape they thought they controlled, was a secret world of passages and chambers where Japanese soldiers waited. This knowledge created a hypervigilance that was psychologically exhausting. Every crevice in the rock, every area of disturbed sand, every slight depression in the ground became a potential threat. Men developed a kind of twitching anxiety, the constant expectation that death was about to emerge from an unexpected direction. Over time, this kind of stress broke men in ways that conventional combat did not. A wound heals, but the certainty that the enemy was always behind you, always invisible, always present, was harder to repair. The Japanese themselves had grown proficient at exploiting the tunnel system as both a shelter and a weapon. Small groups of soldiers would move through the passages at night, emerging to attack positions that had been established the previous day. They had learned to avoid concentration, to keep their numbers dispersed so that no single sealed tunnel would account for more than a handful of men. Kuribayashi had forbidden the kind of massive banzai charges that had characterized earlier battles in the Pacific. Instead, his orders called for sustained, low-level resistance, constant pressure, attrition. Every Marine who died on Iwo Jima would be one less Marine available for the next objective, the next island, the next phase of the war. This was a war of mathematics, and the Japanese understood that they could not win by conventional military standards, but they could bleed the Americans so severely that Tokyo's negotiators might still find a way to change the terms of surrender, might still extract some concession that made the sacrifice meaningful. The tunnels were the vehicle through which this strategy would be executed. They were not meant to win the battle. They were meant to make winning the battle so expensive that Americans would question whether winning was worth the cost. And then there were the wounded men. A Japanese soldier, severely injured, and knowing he would not survive his wounds, would wait in a tunnel for Marines to pass overhead. He would detonate grenades strapped to his body, sometimes killing himself and the enemy soldiers near him, sometimes simply injuring them enough to pull them out of the line for a few crucial hours. It was a form of suicide attack, but not the wholesale banzai charge that Americans had learned to expect. It was disciplined, rationed, economical. It was one man choosing to end his own life in such a way that it cost the Americans something tangible in return. The morality of such acts was incomprehensible to the American Marines, many of whom had been taught that surrender was the option available to a wounded man, that giving up was possible, and even preferable to death. The Japanese had a different understanding entirely. Surrender was shame, and death was preferable to shame. And if death could also be used as a weapon, then that death had purpose. The Marines learned to expect this, to watch for the telltale movement of a man reaching for grenades. But the knowledge that it was coming did not make it less disturbing when it happened. The problem of sealed tunnels became increasingly urgent as the battle progressed into its second and third weeks. A Marine engineer could destroy a cave entrance with explosives, could watch as tons of rock collapsed across the opening, could declare it sealed. But the tunnel system was so extensive that a sealed cave often meant only a temporary barrier. Japanese soldiers would dig through the rubble from the other side, would bore new passages around the collapse, would emerge from a different opening hours or days later. This created a grotesque form of mole and hole, where Marines would seal a position only to discover that they had merely created a new problem in a different location. The Americans began to adopt more permanent solutions. Flamethrower tanks, vehicles designed to burn away jungle and exposed fortifications, proved devastatingly effective against the tunnel entrances. A jet of burning gasoline, propelled into a cave mouth, would spread through the passages and chambers with terrifying speed. The oxygen would be consumed, the temperature would spike, and any men sheltering in those tunnels would die from either the flames or the sudden absence of breathable air. The flamethrower tanks became, to the Japanese defenders, the most feared weapons on the island. They could not be stopped by ordinary rifle fire. Their range was too great to assault with hand grenades, and their effect was absolutely final. But flamethrower tanks could not be everywhere at once, and they required infantry protection because they were vulnerable to concentrated anti-tank fire. This meant that the American assault on the tunnel system required a coordinated, systematic approach that was far more complex than simply destroying a fortification and moving on. A typical operation might involve a platoon of Marines establishing a cordon around a cave area, flamethrower teams moving to designated positions, engineers preparing demolition charges, and riflemen ready to suppress Japanese fire that would inevitably emerge from other tunnel entrances as the main assault developed. It was slow, methodical work that consumed hours and sometimes entire days to clear an area that looked, on the surface, as though it should have taken minutes. But the invisible enemy had learned to use vertical space, and the Americans had learned, through painful trial and error, that conventional assault tactics would result in unacceptable casualties when applied to underground warfare. The use of demolition charges evolved into increasingly brutal efficiency as the campaign progressed. Marines would place satchel charges filled with explosives in the mouths of caves, light the fuse, retreat, and detonate the charge with enough force to collapse the entrance and seal the tunnel beyond it. But this was not the definitive solution either, because caves often had multiple entrances, and sealing one meant only that the passage would open elsewhere. The Americans began to use what they called camouflages, explosives buried as deep as possible within a tunnel system and detonated from the surface. The resulting shock waves would travel through the rock, collapsing passages from within, killing men who were sheltering in chambers hundreds of feet below the point of detonation. The Japanese had anticipated this, to some degree, by building countermeasures into the most important chambers, but they had not anticipated the scale and intensity of the assault. Flamethrower tanks and demolition charges were being used in combinations, in sequences, in coordinated assaults that treated the tunnel system not as a traditional fortification, but as a geological problem that required both burning and structural collapse to solve. The strain on the American assault units was evident in the casualty figures and in the condition of the men themselves. A Marine unit that arrived on Iwo Jima with 600 men in its ranks might have 200 men still present for duty after 2 weeks of fighting in the Central Plateau. The replacements that arrived from the rear would be integrated into the unit, and the cycle would begin again. But the core of experienced, trained men was being systematically ground down, and the replacements, however motivated, lacked the knowledge of how to anticipate the invisible enemy, how to avoid the tunnel entrances, how to move through terrain that seemed peaceful but was actually lethal with hidden threat. Platoon leaders and squad leaders, the men responsible for keeping their soldiers alive, developed a kind of haunted, focused expression. They understood that the tunnel system was something their men could not overcome through conventional means, that they were locked in a form of combat that required patience, coordination, and a willingness to accept casualties that in any other war would have been considered unacceptable. The Marine divisions on Iwo Jima had been told the battle would take 2 weeks. By the time the tunnel system's true extent became apparent, men had already been fighting for those 2 weeks, and no end was visible. The invisible enemy had a final advantage that the Americans were only slowly beginning to understand. The tunnels, and the men who inhabited them, were connected to an enormous supply of motivation that went beyond the survival instinct. Kuribayashi's orders, circulated throughout the garrison, had emphasized that every man would die on Iwo Jima, that there would be no evacuation, no reinforcement, no relief. But that death would have meaning if every American life taken was a contribution to Japan's ultimate survival. The war could not be won on this island, Kuribayashi understood, but it could be made so costly that American planners would recoil from the final assault on the home islands themselves. Every meter of ground paid for in American blood was a meter that weakened the American resolve for what was coming next. The tunnels were not just a fortification. They were a statement, carved into volcanic rock by thousands of men over months of labor, that Japan would contest its own extinction with every resource, every strategy, and every life available. The Americans, facing an enemy that lived in darkness and seemed to multiply with each engagement, were confronted with a form of warfare that had no easy solution, no moment of decisive victory, only the grinding, endless work of breaking through rock and fire to reach an enemy that had literally put the earth itself between itself and its destroyers. Across the dark sand of Iwo Jima, in the spaces between gunfire and explosion, there moved a quieter kind of courage. The Navy corpsmen attached to Marine units were not frontline fighters in the traditional sense. They carried no combat rifle. Their weapon was knowledge. Knowledge of how to stop bleeding, how to ease pain, how to keep a man alive long enough to get him off the island. Yet in the grinding combat of late February and through March of 1945, these young sailors became targets themselves, marked by the Geneva Convention armbands and medical insignia that made them instantly recognizable to Japanese snipers and machine gunners who knew exactly what to aim for. They came forward anyway, crawling through volcanic ash and small arms fire, their medical kits growing lighter and more frequently emptied as the battle wore on. The corpsmen were mostly volunteers, drawn from the fleet's medical personnel and attached to individual marine companies and battalions at a ratio of 1 or 2 men per 100 combatants. They were young, many barely 20 or 21 years old, with a few months of combat medical training and no real preparation for the scale of trauma they would witness. Their arrival on the beaches of Iwo Jima on the 19th of February marked the beginning of a sustained ordeal that would test not just their medical knowledge, but their capacity to make unbearable choices under fire. Within the first hour of landing, before most Marines had advanced 100 meters inland, corpsmen were already at work in the volcanic black sand, kneeling beside wounded men, applying tourniquets, starting plasma transfusions with makeshift stands fashioned from rifle bayonets, and moving their patients toward the beach and toward evacuation ships they could barely see through the smoke and chaos. One of these corpsmen, a man who would become known through the records kept by his unit, typified the pattern that would repeat across Iwo Jima for more than a month. He was a hospital apprentice, a rating that in the Navy meant skilled medical training, but limited rank and authority. Yet in the killing ground of the first days, he moved with such deliberation and presence that Marines in his company began to unconsciously group around him when wounded men fell, trusting his calm voice and steady hands more than any officer's orders. Accounts from survivors describe him moving between fire and position, never running, never appearing panicked, treating wounds on the black sand with the same focus he might have used in a proper hospital ward. The Japanese knew what his armbands meant. He was shot twice, once in the arm, once in the leg, and continued working. Only when he collapsed from blood loss himself did other Marines physically carry him toward the aid stations being established in shallow craters and behind whatever sparse cover the terrain offered. The concept of the aid station on Iwo Jima bore little resemblance to its name. There were no stations in any traditional sense. There were shell craters deepened by shovel work, where corpsmen and a few medical officers attempted to sort the wounded into categories: those who might survive with treatment, those whose wounds suggested they would not make it regardless, and those still able to fight after hasty bandaging. The work was performed under sporadic fire, in darkness when night fell, and in constant awareness that every minute spent treating a patient was a minute the corpsman was immobilized and vulnerable. Hospital ships circled offshore, their hulls marked with red crosses, waiting for the steady stream of small boats and LCVPs that would bring the wounded from the beach. The triage process became an exercise in mathematics no doctor should have to contemplate: which lives could be saved with the resources at hand, and which could not. As the battle extended into its second and third weeks, the flow of wounded never diminished. It deepened. Men who had been lightly wounded early in the battle came back through the system again, with new injuries, or with infection setting in beneath hasty field dressings. Amputation became routine. The hospital ships, which had seemed impossibly large and well-equipped in their preparations, became crowded and overwhelmed. Medical officers made decisions about pain management, knowing that morphine supplies were finite and might run out. Corpsmen worked in shifts that stretched longer and longer, until there was barely any distinction between day and night, just an endless cycle of incoming wounded, triage decisions, treatment, and evacuation. Some corpsmen became so accustomed to the sound of incoming fire that they barely looked up from their work when shells landed nearby. Others developed a haunted quality, their eyes taking on the distant focus of men who had seen too much too young. The Medal of Honor actions recorded from Iwo Jima often involved corpsmen because their actions were inherently visible and documented. They were the ones who ran forward into heavy fire to reach men who had fallen in exposed positions. They were the ones who continued working despite their own wounds, or the knowledge that remaining in one location increased the likelihood they would be specifically targeted. The records and accounts speak of corpsmen who stayed with dying men so they would not be alone, corpsmen who shielded wounded patients with their own bodies when grenades landed nearby, corpsmen who organized stretcher teams and led them through enemy fire to get the most severely wounded to aid stations. One account, repeated in various forms by different witnesses, describes a corpsman who used his last morphine syringe to ease the pain of a man whose injuries were so severe that survival was impossible. He stayed with that man until the end, then moved on to the next casualty, his hands shaking but his voice steady. The toll on the medical system extended beyond the physical. Psychiatric casualties began to appear with increasing frequency as the battle aged. Marines who had seen too much, endured too much, and whose minds simply could not continue to process the trauma around them. They were not weak men or cowards. They were men whose psychological reserves had been emptied by weeks of continuous combat, by the loss of friends and leaders, by the relentless nature of fighting an enemy who would not surrender and appeared to be willing to die rather than yield a meter of ground. Corpsmen worked with medical officers to identify these men and try to get them to the hospital ships, but the definition of what constituted a psychiatric casualty severe enough to warrant evacuation remained contested. Some commanders insisted that rotating men off the line temporarily was equivalent to cowardice and refused to permit it. Others recognized the reality and worked to get their men some rest and recovery. The letters that survived from this period provide a window into the minds of men who understood, with increasing clarity as the battle progressed, that they might not leave the island alive. Marines wrote to mothers, wives, and sweethearts, with a directness about death that is difficult to process from a distance. They wrote about friends who had died, about their own fears and determination, about what they hoped their deaths might mean if it came to that. Some letters were written in the margins of newspaper pages, or on the backs of captured Japanese documents. Others were written on formal letter paper the supply system had managed to provide. Many were never sent because the men who wrote them did not survive to post them. Some were discovered on bodies after the battle, carefully folded and addressed to someone at home, a final message that no longer mattered because the messenger was gone. The hospital ships themselves became characters in the story of Iwo Jima, their holds filled with hundreds of men at a time, their decks organized like desperate puzzles, with stretchers packed side by side. The ship's medical personnel worked in conditions of controlled crisis that extended throughout the entire campaign, and for weeks afterward, as men were transferred between hospital ships and, eventually, to larger hospital facilities in the rear. Some of the most severely wounded were transported to hospitals in the Mariana Islands, or even back to Hawaii. The journey itself killed some men who might have survived with better resources or faster evacuation. Others pulled through injuries that seemed unsurvivable, their recovery aided by the sheer competence of the medical staff and the advantages of modern medicine, even under the constraints of shipboard treatment. What distinguished the corpsmen of Iwo Jima was not their medical training, which was standard for the time. It was their choice to continue doing their work, knowing they were targets, knowing they would see horrors, knowing that no amount of skill or dedication could save everyone. They were ordinary young men, placed in extraordinary circumstances, and asked to perform work that demanded equal parts technical skill and moral courage. Some of them survived the battle with physical and psychological wounds they carried for the rest of their lives. Others did not survive at all. They became casualties themselves, their names recorded in official histories and in the memories of the men they had treated, often the last face a dying Marine would see, the voice providing comfort in the moments before death came across the dark sand. The scale of casualties at Iwo Jima produced statistics that were difficult to comprehend. More than 7,000 Americans killed and more than 20,000 wounded. Behind each statistic was a corpsman or a series of corpsmen who had attempted to save that life or ease that death. The medical infrastructure that had been transported to support the amphibious assault was adequate only by comparison to what nothing would have been. It was inadequate to the actual scale of trauma the island produced. Yet somehow, through the work of thousands of medical personnel and the courage of the corpsmen who crawled through fire with bandages and morphine, the vast majority of the wounded Americans who reached a treatment facility survived. Of the more than 20,000 wounded, fewer than 1,000 ultimately died of their wounds, a survival rate that speaks to the competence of the medical system even under the most adverse conditions. In the weeks after the battle officially ended, the hospital ships continued their slow passage back toward rear area medical facilities. They passed near Iwo Jima at night sometimes, and men recovering on the deck, wrapped in blankets despite the tropical heat, could see the glow of fires still burning on the island where demolition teams were sealing caves and destroying ordnance. Some of the men aboard those ships would never fully recover. Some would carry the wounds of Iwo Jima for the rest of their lives. Limbs lost, vision gone, hearing damaged by the constant percussion of artillery fire. Others bore wounds that were invisible but no less real. The psychological scars of having faced death and survived. The guilt of having lived while friends died. the weight of memories that would surface suddenly and unexpectedly for decades to come. The corpsmen returned home differently than the combat marines, who had been the faces of the flag raising. They had no photograph to represent them, no enduring image of their sacrifice. Yet in the accounting of Iwo Jima's human cost, their presence was essential. They were the ones who had rendered the battle somewhat less tragic than it might have been, who had taken the mathematics of triage and casualty management and infused them with humanity. They were the ones who had run forward when prudence suggested retreat, who had used their skill and composure to buy time, to reduce suffering, to save lives when the island itself seemed designed to take them. They are remembered, when they are remembered at all, not through monuments or official ceremonies, but through the gratitude of men who survived, because a corpsman had been there, in the ash and the noise, with steady hands and a voice that said, "You're going to be okay," or "You're not alone," or simply, "I'm here." By the beginning of March 1945, the geography of Iwo Jima had compressed into a metaphor for Japan's own shrinking empire. The American Marines, having secured Mount Suribachi and pushed northward across the lower plateau, now faced the true spine of Kuribayashi's defense, a twisted landscape of ridges, ravines, and fortified positions that stretched across the island's narrowing northern third. The Japanese general's underground kingdom was no longer a network spanning the entire island. It had become a fortress within a fortress, a tightening noose of concrete and steel wrapped around the remaining strongpoints. From his command post, deep beneath the surface, Kuribayashi could read the American advance, not as defeat in theory, but as a contraction he had expected, planned for, and orchestrated through months of meticulous preparation. Every meter of ground lost was a meter closer to the final stand he had sworn to make. The Americans were grinding toward him with inexorable pressure, but the closer they came, the more concentrated his fire would become. In the mathematics of underground warfare, compression meant concentration, and concentration meant maximum casualties for the enemy pressing from above. The Japanese general's communications with Tokyo during the first 3 weeks of March reveal a man who possessed perfect clarity about his situation, while maintaining an unshakable resolve that bordered on the transcendent. Radio messages dispatched from his headquarters, some intercepted and translated by American intelligence, show Kuribayashi writing with the precision of a man accounting for his final days. He reported his troop strength in declining numbers, each transmission bringing word of thousands fewer soldiers available for the next defensive line, each figure a mathematical expression of loss. Ammunition reports grew shorter and more urgent. Ammunition was becoming a limiting factor, not because supplies could be found, but because there was nowhere left to store reserves. Water, the perpetual curse of Iwo Jima, remained scarce, and wounded men, without access to adequate medical supplies, deteriorated in the tunnels beneath the volcanic rock. Yet in these same messages, Kuribayashi refused all offers of honorable withdrawal, refused all suggestions that might presage surrender. He acknowledged to Tokyo that organized defense would become impossible within days, that his perimeter was shrinking, that casualties continued to mount. He stated these facts as though reading from a ledger, and then he repeated his orders. Every man would fight until he could fight no longer. The phrase that emerges repeatedly in Kuribayashi's final communications is one that translates roughly as fighting to the last man, but it carries a weight in Japanese military culture that Americans reading the intercepted messages could only partially comprehend. This was not a vague call for last-ditch heroism. It was a specific order to preserve discipline, to prevent panic, to avoid the wasteful suicidal charges that had bloodied Saipan and Tinian. Kuribayashi's genius lay partly in what he forbade his men to do. As American pressure mounted and the perimeter contracted, the temptation for desperate banzai attacks would have been almost overwhelming. A chance to strike one final blow, to die fighting rather than waiting in the dark. The Japanese general strangled that impulse before it could take hold. His orders were to hold positions, to make the Americans pay for every advance, to extract maximum casualties, not through wild rushes, but through disciplined, calculated defense from fortified positions. This was a harder thing to ask of soldiers who knew they were approaching their own extinction. It required not courage alone, but the deeper capacity to endure with purpose, even when hope had died. Kuribayashi demanded that capacity from his men, and his authority, built through months of visible competence and respect, held it in place, even as the end drew near. By the second week of March, American forces had compressed the Japanese perimeter into a northern pocket roughly 2 kilometers across, a tangle of fortified ridges and interconnected tunnels that Marines and Army soldiers approached with grim determination. The individual strongpoints had names born of proximity and desperation: the Gorge, the Amphitheater, Charlie Dog Ridge, Cushman's Pocket. These were not grand fortifications visible from a distance, but clusters of interlocking positions where Japanese soldiers, numbering perhaps 3,000 to 4,000, held observation of all approaches and controlled killing zones that had been calculated and prepared for months. The American advance had slowed almost to a crawl, measured now not in miles or kilometers, but in yards and meters. Sometimes only hundreds of meters per day, despite overwhelming firepower advantage. Flamethrower tanks moved forward through volcanic rock that offered no clear paths, followed by Marines on foot, who had to rout enemy soldiers from positions that seemed to regenerate as fast as they were destroyed. Artillery support was constant, ceaseless, laying down barrages that shook the island and sent shockwaves through the tunnel systems below. Yet still the Japanese returned fire from positions that appeared to have been completely destroyed hours before, emerging from secondary tunnels and alternate exits that the Americans had not yet located or couldn't seal fast enough. Kuribayashi's final days as a commanding general are marked by an almost monastic adherence to military duty, even as the reality of his situation became absolute. His command post, located near the village of Motoyama, in the northern section of the island, was itself burrowed so deep in the volcanic rock that he would have been impervious to the heaviest bombardment, but isolation underground, no matter how secure, could not insulate him from knowledge of what was happening above. Reports from subordinate commanders grew briefer as the officers themselves began to fall, killed in the fighting or trapped in tunnel collapses caused by American demolition charges and sustained artillery. Kuribayashi received these reports with the equanimity of a man who had accepted from the start that this battle was unwinnable in the traditional sense. Unwinnable because the Americans had more men, more firepower, more ships, and more supplies. What he was fighting for was not victory, but something else entirely: the maximum extraction of a price, the denial of easy triumph, the enforcement of respect for Japanese soldiers, even in defeat. To allow the Americans a quick victory would have been to accept the narrative that Japan's soldiers could not fight, would not endure, would collapse when pressure was applied. Kuribayashi would not give Tokyo, or the American Navy, or history that satisfaction. The final radio transmission attributed to General Kuribayashi, dispatched in the middle of March from his underground command post to Japanese headquarters in Tokyo, is worth examining in detail because it captures both his clinical assessment and his spiritual preparation for death. The message is composed in formal military language, respectful of protocol and chain of command. Kuribayashi reports that organized resistance on Iwo Jima will cease within days, that the enemy has concentrated overwhelming force on the remaining pocket, that ammunition is nearly expended. He acknowledges that reinforcement is impossible and that capitulation is not an option. Then he delivers a statement that, translated into English, reads as follows: "The entire garrison is resolved to stake their lives on the defense of this island." He does not plead, does not ask for rescue, does not seek amelioration of his fate. He simply states the fact that his men will not surrender, that they will fight as long as consciousness remains, that their deaths will be on their own terms. This message, intercepted and translated by American intelligence, was understood by some American commanders as a final statement of defiance. Others, reading it more carefully, recognized something more profound: a general saying goodbye. The compression of the Japanese perimeter in the final days of organized resistance coincided with a shift in American tactics toward what commanders euphemistically called mop-up operations. The term obscures the brutal reality. American forces were engaged in systematic elimination of an enemy that could no longer retreat, had nowhere to retreat to, and had no expectation of mercy or quarter. Surrender remained possible in theory. The Americans had not announced a policy of wholesale slaughter. Yet the losses suffered by the Americans in preceding weeks, the terrible casualty lists, the sense that every Japanese soldier killed was one fewer who could fire from a hidden position. All of this created an atmosphere in which Japanese soldiers who attempted to surrender often did not survive the attempt. Some were shot before they could communicate their intention. Others emerged from tunnels with weapons and opened fire, blurring the distinction between surrender and ambush. The conditions for honorable capitulation, which might have existed earlier in the battle, had largely evaporated by mid-March. Japanese soldiers, who wanted to die fighting, had only to keep their weapons and remain in the tunnels. Those who wanted to survive faced an almost impossible gamble. As the Japanese perimeter compressed through the last 2 weeks of March, the fighting took on a character almost more brutal than the initial landings, not because the violence was greater in absolute terms, but because it was more intimate, more inescapable, and more suffocating. Americans could not simply surround the Japanese pocket and starve it out. Kuribayashi's tunnel system provided shelter from artillery and bombardment, and the Japanese general had stockpiled enough supplies to sustain resistance for some days longer. So the Americans were forced to enter the tunnels themselves, or to seal them from the outside, or to accept the continuation of sniper fire and artillery strikes from Japanese positions that did not surrender. Marines and soldiers moved through rock and ash, their movements watched by Japanese observers from positions so cunningly concealed that a man could move past one and never see it. Flamethrower teams burned cave entrances, but new exits appeared kilometers away. Demolition experts blew up bunkers, but the tunnel's three-dimensional geometry meant that blowing one passage sometimes simply directed Japanese defenders towards secondary routes. The Americans were trying to kill an invisible enemy that lived below their feet and could theoretically continue to live below their feet indefinitely, or until they were forced to the surface by thirst, starvation, or suffocation. Kuribayashi's personal fate remains the subject of historical debate, as the circumstances of his final hours were not witnessed by any American observer, and the Japanese records available are fragmentary. Some accounts suggest he was killed in action by American artillery or small arms fire during the final days of organized resistance. Others indicate he survived until late March and either died in a suicide attack or took his own life as the last positions fell. What is clear from contemporary reports is that by the third week of March, the general's command and control had become increasingly tenuous, that his formal authority had begun to dissolve into local decisions made by junior officers in isolated positions, and that the grand orchestration that had characterized his defense in the early phases of the battle had given way to individual acts of desperate courage or futile last stands. The contrast is telling. Early in the battle, Kuribayashi's hand was visible in coordinated fire, in the calculated retreat from forward positions to secondary strongholds, in the preservation of force for maximum effect. By late March, the battle had fragmented into hundreds of small engagements, each one decided by the men present on the ground, each one less dependent on the general's will and more dependent on the individual's willingness to fight and die. The gradual silencing of organized Japanese resistance in the final days of March proceeded not as a single dramatic moment, but as a progressive diminution of enemy fire. Fewer artillery barrages, fewer coordinated attacks, fewer organized positions holding multiple weapons. American forces, measuring their advance in yards per day, found themselves occasionally moving hundreds of yards without encountering opposition, only to be struck without warning from directions that had seemed clear. The northern pocket, once filled with the sounds of combat, the crash of artillery, the clatter of machine gun fire, the boom of demolition charges, grew quieter as the number of combatants dwindled. Prisoners taken in these final days numbered only in the dozens, a fraction of the thousands of defenders who had begun the battle. Most Japanese soldiers chose death over surrender, whether through continued combat or through deliberate acts of self-destruction. The Americans, moving through the devastated terrain, found caves stuffed with the bodies of Japanese soldiers who had died from wounds, disease, or deliberate choice. The island's air, already sulphurous and malodorous, took on the additional smell of decomposition and cremation as burial details worked to account for the dead and prevent disease. By the 26th of March 1945, organized resistance on Iwo Jima was effectively concluded, though this victory was not as clean or as definitive as military terminology might suggest. The American flag flew from the island's command center. The strategic objective, the capture of the airfields and the elimination of the Japanese garrison, was achieved. But pockets of Japanese soldiers remained hidden in the tunnel system, and the killing would continue for days and weeks as these holdouts were flushed out or starved into submission. Some Japanese soldiers, the historical record suggests, remained undetected in caves and tunnels for months after the main battle ended, emerging only when certain starvation or discovery became inevitable. The island that had been Kuribayashi's underground fortress became, in the battle's aftermath, a labyrinth of death and discovery, a place where American soldiers had to remain vigilant even after victory was declared, where danger could still emerge from the earth itself. The general's legacy was not his survival. He did not survive, but the lasting impression he left on American commanders and soldiers. He had been taken seriously, honored by adversaries who recognized that his defense, though defeated, had been conducted with discipline and intelligence, rather than suicidal desperation. What Kuribayashi had accomplished, in his final stand and throughout the entire battle, was to impose a cost on the American advance that would resonate through the remaining months of the war and beyond. The loss of more than 6,000 American dead and 20,000 wounded on Iwo Jima, a small island of 8 square miles, would be absorbed into the larger calculus of Pacific strategy. Planners sitting in rooms in Washington, looking at maps and casualty statistics, would use the blood spent on Iwo Jima as evidence that invading the Japanese home islands would cost far more American lives than strategic bombing alone. Kuribayashi could not have known this in his final hours, could not have anticipated that his last stand would subtly influence the decision not to invade Japan and to use atomic weapons instead. But his battle plan, his insistence that every meter of ground be paid for in American blood, his refusal to squander his men in futile gestures, all of this contributed to the growing consensus among American leadership that Japan's defeat should be accomplished with the minimum expenditure of American lives, even if that meant deploying weapons so terrible they would reshape the entire post-war world. In this sense, Kuribayashi's last stand, conducted in the dark tunnels beneath Iwo Jima in the final days of March 1945, reached into the future and touched events he could never have foreseen. By the middle of March 1945, the American lines had compressed the Japanese garrison into an ever-shrinking pocket in the northern sector of Iwo Jima. What had once been a coordinated defense spanning the entire 8-square-mile island had become a series of desperate last stands in caves and tunnels, connected by passages that were themselves becoming death traps as Marines sealed them with demolition charges and flamethrower fire. The weather had worsened. Frequent rain soaked the black sand and turned the volcanic terrain into a maze of mud and stone, making every advance slower and more costly than the day before. Marine commanders began to sense that the end was approaching, though not the kind of end they had hoped for when they landed 4 weeks earlier. There would be no sudden collapse, no moment of clear victory, only the grinding attrition of an enemy that had been trained to die rather than surrender, and an American force that had become nearly as exhausted as the defenders themselves. The question was not whether the island would fall, but how many more men would have to die before it did. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the architect of the island's transformation into a fortress, remained in contact with Japanese military command in Tokyo through radio communications, even as his world contracted to a few square kilometers of caves and rubble. The general was fully aware by mid-March that the situation was hopeless. His garrison had been reduced to a fraction of its original strength, with no possibility of reinforcement or resupply. Yet in every communication with Tokyo, Kuribayashi was unyielding. He refused to authorize any general surrender, refused to order his men to lay down their arms, and continued to issue directives that every position be held until the last man had fallen. Some of his final radio messages, transmitted in the darkness when Japanese signalmen risked their lives to keep the radio operational, expressed a quiet acknowledgement of the inevitable outcome, yet carried no sense of despair, only resolve. Kuribayashi understood that by dying on Iwo Jima, by forcing the Americans to bleed for every meter of the island, he was serving a larger strategic purpose that extended beyond the island itself. The greater the cost to the Americans, the more difficult would be their decision to invade the Japanese home islands, a calculation the general may have grasped with a clarity that eluded many in Tokyo's higher command. In the final days of March, American forces had pushed the remaining organized Japanese resistance into a small defensive pocket in the northernmost part of the island, near an area the Marines called Kitano Point. Here, on the 26th of March, the last significant engagement of the battle took place. Not a dramatic charge or a tactical maneuver, but a grinding assault by American tanks and infantry against interconnected bunkers from which Japanese soldiers, many of them wounded, continued to fire until they were killed where they stood or buried by the weight of demolition charges. Kuribayashi himself was reported by Japanese survivors to have spent his final hours in one of the underground command posts, coordinating the last defensive positions through a communications system that was itself fragmenting as the Americans severed tunnels and collapsed cave systems. The general did not emerge to surrender, and no white flag was raised over the northern sector of the island. Instead, as American forces pushed into the last positions on the 26th and 27th of March, they found Kuribayashi's command cave abandoned, and the general himself dead, whether by his own hand or in the final moments of combat. The record remains unclear and would likely have been deliberately obscured by both sides seeking to control the narrative of his end. The formal declaration that organized resistance on Iwo Jima had ended came on the 26th of March, 1945, a statement issued by American commanders that effectively marked the battle's official conclusion, even as sporadic gunfire continued to echo across the island in the days and weeks that followed. This declaration was not arrived at lightly. Marine commanders knew from bitter experience in the Pacific War that Japanese soldiers, especially those who had fought in the manner Kuribayashi had drilled into them, would not simply cease fighting because an officer had died or a command post had been overrun. Small groups of men, isolated in caves and tunnels, would continue to resist for as long as they could move and pull a trigger. The intelligence estimates prepared in the days following the formal declaration reflected this grim knowledge. Japanese soldiers were expected to continue harassing American positions from hidden fortifications for weeks, possibly months. In some cases, this estimate would prove optimistic. Marines would continue to encounter organized groups of Japanese defenders and isolated holdouts for well beyond the official end date, turning what had been declared secure into a continued zone of danger and uncertainty. The total cost of the battle defied comprehension, even to those who had witnessed it directly. For the Japanese, nearly the entire garrison of approximately 21,000 men had been killed. Only a handful surrendered, and fewer still survived capture. The scale of Japanese losses on Iwo Jima was so complete that it shocked even hardened officers who had seen similar patterns of destruction across the island-hopping campaign. Nearly every man who had been sent to defend the island had died on it. The American cost, though smaller in absolute numbers, was devastating in its own proportion and context. Approximately 6,700 American servicemen, predominantly Marines, but including soldiers and sailors, had been killed in the fighting, with more than 19,000 wounded. A significant portion of the casualties were concentrated in the Marine rifle companies and platoons, where losses often exceeded 50% across the course of the entire operation. Some battalions and regiments suffered casualty rates that approached the Japanese proportions. Men who had landed on the 19th of February were by the end of March either dead, wounded, or shell-shocked survivors gathered in replacement drafts from elsewhere in the Pacific. No island in the Pacific War, measured against its size, had consumed American lives more efficiently than this 8-square-mile slab of volcanic rock. The mathematics of the battle were stark and undeniable. The Americans had lost approximately 1 man for every enemy killed, a casualty ratio fundamentally different from earlier island campaigns, and one that troubled military planners immediately, even as the official victory was being announced. General Holland Smith, the overall commander of the amphibious operation, faced pointed questions from visiting dignitaries and press about whether the island had been worth the price. The tactical argument had been clear before the battle. Iwo Jima's location, roughly halfway between the Marianas and Japan, made it an ideal location for fighter escort bases and emergency landing strips for the B-29 bombing campaign. But the human cost was so visible, so immediate, and so stark that it forced even military professionals to grapple with questions that extended beyond simple military calculation. Letters arrived from mothers and wives, asking why their sons and husbands had to die for an island made of black sand and sulfur. The photographs and film footage that emerged from Iwo Jima showed a landscape of devastation that seemed almost apocalyptic, a place that appeared utterly barren of any value once the fighting ended. Yet the airfields would indeed be used, and the lives saved by the island's availability as an emergency base would ultimately number in the thousands as the bombing campaign against Japan intensified over the spring and summer of 1945. The question of Japanese prisoners was complicated by cultural factors, military discipline, and the brutality that had characterized much of the war in the Pacific. Of the estimated 21,000 Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima, fewer than 200 were captured alive during the battle, and many of those surrendered only after being wounded, to the point where continued resistance was physically impossible. The overwhelming majority of the garrison chose death over capture, motivated partly by explicit orders from Kuribayashi, partly by cultural traditions that equated surrender with dishonor, and partly by the well-founded fear of what surrender might mean, given the patterns of violence that had marked the Pacific War. Japanese soldiers who did surrender often reported that they had disobeyed orders in doing so, and that the decision to cease fighting had been an act of defiance against the command structure that would have shot them for attempting to surrender. A few Japanese soldiers, isolated in caves and tunnels, remained hidden long after the formal declaration of the island's security. Some were discovered weeks later, emerging from the ground to attempt to rejoin Japanese forces that no longer existed. A smaller number remained concealed for months, subsisting on whatever food could be found in the caves, and continuing to pose a genuine security risk to American installations, even as the island was being developed as a military base. The American bodies were processed with the efficiency that warfare had forced the military to develop. Graves registration teams worked constantly through the final weeks of March to identify the dead, prepare them for transport, and arrange their movement to temporary cemeteries established on the island and on ships in the harbor. The process was neither rapid nor free from difficulty. Many of the dead were burned beyond easy identification, their names determined only through the recovery of dog tags or identification numbers on uniforms. The Navy corpsmen and medical personnel who had worked under fire throughout the battle were, by the end of March, exhausted to the point of collapse. Some of them would later report that the emotional weight of having survived, when so many around them had not, was in some ways more difficult to carry than the physical and psychological trauma of the fighting itself. The wounded who remained on the island were gradually evacuated to hospital ships, where Navy physicians and surgeons worked overtime, attempting to stabilize men whose injuries ranged from shell fragments to burned flesh to amputation. Some of the wounded would recover and return to duty, but many others would carry the physical and psychological scars of Iwo Jima for the remainder of their lives. In the weeks following the formal declaration of the island's security, American engineers moved rapidly to expand and repair the airfields that had been the ultimate objective of the entire operation. Heavy equipment was brought ashore, and the work of turning the devastated runways into functional bases for the bomber campaign began in earnest. The first B-29 bombers began using Iwo Jima as an emergency landing base in the first week of April 1945, just 2 weeks after the formal declaration of security, and while Japanese holdouts were still occasionally firing from caves in the northern sector of the island. These emergency landings would save the lives of hundreds of bomber crews whose planes had been damaged over Japan and would otherwise have been forced to ditch in the ocean or attempt the long flight back across the Pacific on failing engines. Every bomber that successfully landed on Iwo Jima represented a crew of 10 to 12 men whose survival depended on the island's existence, a concrete vindication of the strategic calculation that had prompted the invasion in the first place, though one that came at a price that still seemed impossibly high, even as the first grateful pilots stepped onto the black sand runway. The psychological impact of Iwo Jima on the American military establishment was immediate and profound. Senior commanders understood that the island's cost, although justified in terms of lives saved among bomber crews, would have significant political implications for any future decisions about invading the Japanese home islands. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had already passed away on the 12th of April 1945, only 2 weeks after the formal declaration of the island's security, and his successor, Harry Truman, inherited a war that was approaching a crisis point over the question of how to force Japan's final surrender. Military planners were already preparing estimates for the cost of invading the main Japanese islands, and Iwo Jima had provided them with a terrible yardstick against which to measure those estimates. If an island of 8 square miles, defended by 21,000 troops with minimal air support and no possibility of reinforcement, had cost 6,700 American lives and more than 19,000 wounded, what would be the cost of invading Honshu and Kyushu, where the Japanese could field hundreds of thousands of defenders on their home soil? The mathematics were horrifying, and they would inform the strategic discussions that would ultimately lead to the decision to use atomic weapons, rather than attempt a full-scale invasion. The last confirmed action of organized Japanese forces on Iwo Jima came several days after the 26th of March, when a group of approximately 300 Japanese soldiers, unable to move without being detected by American patrols, attempted to conduct a final organized assault on American positions. Unlike the suicidal banzai charges that had characterized earlier Pacific battles, this assault was conducted with what witnesses described as a deliberate, disciplined quality. Men moving in formation, attempting to use coordinated tactics rather than throwing themselves at American machine guns in a frenzy of desperation. The action was brief and utterly one-sided. American forces, alert to the possibility of continued organized resistance, and heavily supplied with automatic weapons and supporting artillery, repelled the assault with devastating efficiency. In a matter of minutes, the assault force had been destroyed, and with it died what remained of Kuribayashi's organized garrison. What followed was not the glorious final battle the general had perhaps envisioned, but rather the slow, methodical process of hunting down isolated groups of men hidden in caves and tunnels, many of them wounded and starving, continuing to resist until they were killed, or, in rare cases, persuaded to surrender when the hopelessness of their situation had become undeniable. The final accounting of the battle would occupy military historians and analysts for decades. Iwo Jima had been the bloodiest battle per square meter in the entire Pacific War. It would cost the American military more casualties relative to the size of the defending garrison than any other major amphibious operation. When viewed against the strategic objective, the conquest of an airbase and emergency landing field, the cost seemed almost incomprehensible. Yet, when viewed against the lives saved among bomber crews and the strategic value the island provided in the final months of the war against Japan, the calculation became, at least mathematically, defensible. This tension between tactical horror and strategic necessity would haunt Iwo Jima's legacy for generations. The island had been secured through sacrifice of an order that shocked even those who had fought through the entire Pacific campaign. The tunnels beneath the black sand still held the bones of thousands of men who had died in darkness, their bodies never recovered, their names recorded, but their resting places unknown. The mountain that had seemed to promise victory when the flag was raised on the 23rd of February had turned out to be merely a prelude to something far more terrible: the meat grinder, the invisible enemy, the grinding attrition that only ended when one side had been utterly annihilated and the other had paid a price so steep that it would reshape the final weeks of the war against Japan. By the time the last organized pockets of Japanese resistance collapsed in the final days of March in 1945, Iwo Jima lay in ruins. The volcanic plateau was scarred with bomb craters. The beaches bore the wreckage of landing craft and the temporary graves of thousands. Yet even as the battle still raged in the northern caves, American engineers had already begun their real work on the island, the work that would, in the reckoning of American strategic planners, justify the staggering cost in blood. Within days of the initial landings, bulldozers pushed through the debris. Concrete mixers arrived on supply ships. The 3rd Marine Engineer Battalion and attached Army engineer units began transforming the captured terrain into something the Japanese defenders had never succeeded in fully preventing: forward air bases, from which American air power could reach the very heart of the Japanese Empire. What was Iwo Jima, truly, after the flag raising? It was an airfield. It was in fact 2 airfields, eventually 3, carved from the island's black sand and volcanic rock, connected by taxiways, studded with hard stands, surrounded by anti-aircraft emplacements, and positioned at the exact point where American strategy demanded a pivot from one kind of war to another. The strategic logic that had driven Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Holland Smith to authorize the invasion was sound, if brutal. The B-29 Superfortress was the most advanced bomber in the world, a 4-engine heavy bomber with a pressurized fuselage, capable of carrying 5 tons of ordnance and delivering it with unprecedented accuracy. From bases in the Marianas, principally Saipan and Tinian, these aircraft had begun in November of 1944 to conduct what would become known as the Strategic Bombing Campaign against Japan. The target was the Japanese home islands themselves, the industrial cities and ports that sustained the war machine. But Saipan and Tinian were more than 1,500 kilometers from Tokyo and more than 2,000 kilometers from the southern industrial cities of Osaka and Kobe. That distance meant fuel consumption that left little margin for error. It meant that a B-29 damaged over Japan, struggling with an engine fire or hydraulic failure, had no closer haven than the long route back across open ocean toward the Marianas. And it meant that fighter escorts could not yet accompany the bombers all the way to their targets and back. The ranges were simply too great. American planners understood that Iwo Jima, lying roughly halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo, at a distance of about 1,100 kilometers from each, could change everything. An emergency landing strip there would save lives. A forward fighter base would finally allow escorts to protect the bombers